both here, and I think I'm going to ask the clerk if we can, instead of getting you up at the crack of dawn, if we can next time regularise our times so that we're all our normal bright-eyed, bushy-tailed selves. But thank you for coming in at this time. And we have other witnesses for another inquiry that we're doing on reshuffles a little later.
Right.
So that's the reason we're closing down at 10:30 to go on to that. Welcome, Nick. Would you like to kick off with any opening statement on things that have happened since you last came before us?
Well, first, thank you very much, and of course, more than happy to obviously seek to regularise, as you put it, the time for future meetings. I thought if it would be helpful to the committee, I should just sort of set out some thoughts now that we're sort of roughly halfway through the Parliament to reflect on progress or not on the political constitutional reform agenda. I think a sort of fair scorecard assessment would be that we've made some significant progress. The fixed term Parliaments bill, genuinely radical. I think by this stage, normally in a parliamentary cycle, there'd be lots and lots of politicking about, is the government going to call a general election or not? Thankfully, we're free of that particular blight. Chloe is just this very day introducing the succession to the Crown Bill again, which is a very important constitutional innovation. We're seeking to make progress on lobbying, recall. There are cross-party talks on party funding and so on.
Yeah, should we apply it to the next succession?
Thanks, Paul. We'll make that your first question, but if we can just let the DPM...
I will come back to that. I'll come back to that. But of course, on other issues, we haven't made progress for various reasons, or things have got stuck. House of Lords, electoral reform, boundary changes and so on. And I think it's fair to say that when the public has been asked to either participate in or support changes, it's been less than a wholehearted commitment in favour of reform, whether it was the vote against electoral reform, whether it was the vote against mayors in many places where referenda took place, or the low turnout in the PCC elections. Now, I suppose you could read that as an example of apathy and disinterest. My view is that that's probably extracting the wrong message from that. I think the message is probably twofold. Firstly, that there is still profound, if not growing, public cynicism and apathy, and if not outright hostility towards politics generally, which we must try to seek to address. To simply sort of say we have no role in trying to address that public mood, I think, would be a mistake. And secondly, and quite understandably, in recent, certainly since the last general election, economic issues, economic anxiety, the economic insecurities which are around here and abroad, have quite rightly, quite understandably, I think, put all other considerations into perspective and into their place. So, I think our view is that what we should be seeking to do for the second half of the Parliament is marry more explicitly the political reform agenda to the wider priority of rescuing, repairing and reforming the British economy. And there is, of course, a link. If one were to look at the failings of the British economy over the last decade or two, part of it is because of a very excessive centralisation of the economy in 1 square mile in the City of London, but also excessive decision-making in 1 square mile here in Westminster. And that's why the process towards devolution, decentralisation is, in our view, absolutely central to the reinvention, rewiring of the British economy, whether it's the Scotland Act, which we passed earlier on in this Parliament, which by 2016 will mean that £1 in every £3 of public money are raised by the Scottish Parliament, whether it's the progress we've made on giving more legislative powers to the Welsh Assembly and the Silk Commission, which is now examining some very radical further steps towards devolution in Wales. We're looking constructively at the case for the devolution of corporation tax in Northern Ireland rather. In England, we've spearheaded these groundbreaking 8 new city deals, which are in my view, far more radical than they've been than has been widely appreciated, because they really do cut the purse strings between Whitehall and particularly the Treasury and our big cities, particularly in the north. We've granted very considerable new powers over transport, skills, funding, capital investment and so on to our 8 biggest cities. We're going to spread it to many other towns and cities, and I hope very much to see that city deal principle of decentralisation over money, of the nuts and bolts of local economic decision making, spread across the country as a whole. We're transforming local government finance. There'll be a sort of local share of business rates, a 50% share of business rates, which will be localised from next April. Under the Localism Act, councils from next year will be able to decide how most of their central government grants should be spent. The tax increment financing means they can borrow more money. We've got these proposals from Lord Heseltine, ones that in principle, there's a lot of detail to thrash out, but in principle we're very supportive of, which would dramatically change the balance of power between the local and the central in terms of economic decision making, and we intend to respond to that more fully in the new year. And I know, of course, that this committee is looking at options of enshrining the independence of local government, and I'm very keen to engage with you on that. The reason I just cantered through that list is that is a very considerable and very ambitious both economic and constitutional agenda of decentralisation and devolution. And it's a big focus for me, it's a big focus for my team, it's a big focus for the government as a whole. And I'm resolved that by the end of this Parliament, every part of Great Britain will be more decentralised than it was when we came into office in 2010. And I very much hope that that is something which is of both interest to the committee, but also something we can work together with you on in the remaining stages of this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. Chloe, did you want to add anything?
I'm happy to get stuck into questions.
Okay. A couple of quick ones from me before I ask Eleanor to talk to you. The first one is about the concept of the mid-term refresh. We have a 5-year Parliament, and it's unique, hopefully not the only one we're ever going to have, but it's a beginning of a new structure. So being around halfway through, you've already outlined a lot of things that you intend to do anyway, but is there going to be some formal discussion within government about a sort of plan for the next half of the Parliament, so to speak?
Yes, there is. We call it a mid-term review, and we will be publishing it in the new year. In fact, the Prime Minister and I spent a fair amount of time yesterday afternoon going over some of the details in it, and it'll serve basically 2 purposes. First, it'll be an audit, if you like, of what we have achieved compared to what we set out to achieve in the coalition agreement. The coalition agreement was very clear and very transparent in what we said we were going to do, and I think it's right that at this halfway point we judge ourselves against our own benchmarks, and I think in some areas we'll be able to show that we've overachieved, and in other areas where we have not achieved as much as we would have liked. So it'll be quite a sort of candid assessment, quite a simple sort of assessment of what we've done, but I think on the whole I hope it'll actually surprise on the upside. We have achieved a great deal of the coalition agreement in terms of implementing it. And then secondly, the second part of it, which is still the subject of course of discussion within the coalition, is what new initiatives do we want to highlight or announce in the mid-term review as being important new steps that we want to take, legislative and policy steps, in the second half of the Parliament. Given those discussions are ongoing, I think it would be fruitless and wrong of me to dwell on the details of them, but it'll be it'll be very much flowing from many of the policy orientations we've already established, but extending them further. And I hope that does both provides a sort of candid assessment, if you like, a sort of self-assessment system, if you like, by the coalition government, but also sets out some clear priorities for us in the remaining stages in which this government is in power during this fixed-term Parliament session. And
would we be right to assume that there will be, in some of the things that will happen or proposed to happen in the future, reference to some of the stuff that we've been talking to you about in terms of further decentralisation, the other reports we're doing on how the business of the House runs, and those sort of democratic things that are within your remit?
Well, what we're not going to do is we're not going to include in the midterm review, otherwise it just become too sort of clunky and unwieldy, is, how can I put it, things which are in the pipeline already,
Yeah.
which we're pushing already. It's more to set out areas where we're determined to break new ground. So I wouldn't encourage you to expect that we're going to capture in the midterm review many things that we're working on already, not least some of the items that I've been describing here in terms of political and economic decentralisation.
And just as a news item, you may wish to comment on, Deputy Prime Minister, we are going to write today to every permanent secretary asking what the 5-year fixed term is doing for them in terms of deciding their longer term priorities. It gives them a planning horizon that they've never had before, and what each department is doing to capitalise on the Prime Minister's decision to have a fixed term parliament.
Very good, very good.
Can I just comment?
Sure.
Just on
that, in terms of 5-year planning horizons, now that we have these fixed term parliaments, do you see some need to regularise the timescale in which opposition has access to civil service facilities? Previously, this was sort of an ad hoc situation. Now we have a fixed term parliament. I mean, sort of rationally, opposition probably should begin to have access to the civil service about a year before the election. Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't want to speculate on exactly which sort of what calendar date you should make those resources available to the opposition, but you're quite right in principle that if you know when the general election is going to be, you can also take advanced decisions about the kind of support that is given to opposition in a much more sort of fluid way before. But whether that should be a year before, I mean, that's not something which I'm not. It's not sort of science, sort of exact science that. But you're quite right. The principle is clear. That's one of the many steps that governments have traditionally taken ahead of general elections that can now be taken in a planned way rather than in a kind of slightly sort of by the seat of your pants way.
Perhaps we could leave that question with you, Deputy Prime Minister,
Yep.
and I'm sure someone in the department somewhere is probably working out these calculations. It would be helpful to drop us a line.
Yeah, no, look, I've got no complaints at all with the idea that you have clarity and transparency on when what is by convention something which happens anyway, which is that oppositions, I found that before the last general election immensely helpful to have access to the civil service to test some of our manifesto policies. All I'm saying is I'm not wedded to a particular date. What I totally accept that you're saying is quite right. Is that it's one of the many informal mechanisms that we can now make a little bit more transparent, a little more predictable, precisely because the fixed term parliament framework establishes a stable calendar in which we all operate.
If you feel appropriate to drop us a further line on that once you've had a chance to think further about it, feel free. And the final thing from me is part of the stuff about fixed term leads across to our other inquiry at the moment, which is about reshuffles. And it seems that many of the witnesses, and we have 3 other eminent witnesses today, are raising the possibility of a more regular and less abrupt way of managing the business of government. I can't take it any further than that, but there may be an implication, a read across from fixed terms to a slightly more professional way of appointing and retaining people in government.
Is that a question or a statement?
It was a question mark at the end.
Oh, right. It was dot, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was a raised eyebrow.
Respond to dot. The only observation I would make, I'm personally not persuaded that because you have a fixed term parliament, because you know when the next election is going to be, that has a knock-on effect on imposing, if you like, a timetable on a prime minister about when they hold reshuffles. I think it's quite right to keep that discretion for the leaders of governments to decide how they compose their teams and to chop and change. So I don't personally see the link there. I'd only observe, having been through this once, that the novel complexities of reshuffle are more to do with having 2 parties in government than the fact there's a fixed-term parliament bill. That creates an added twist to the Rubik's Cube, because you've got 2 teams who are having to kind of be reshuffled almost in parallel and then also fit together. So I think there's I think there's interesting speculation about how you try and handle that, rather than any direct knock-on effect between when you know a general election is going to be and changing or hampering the Prime Minister's discretion on when to hold reshuffles. That's my own. Since you invited ...
Yes.
to respond,
Where other nations have fixed terms,
Yeah.
and classically in America, there's often a bemusement that we wish to shake up the team in several times in the course of a job that they've been appointed to do.
Yeah.
And the element of stability which a fixed term brings may have a consequence of bringing some more stability to the governance of the country, the relations with select committees, the stability also within the civil service, knowing the bosses there, barring deaths and scandals for a longer term. But
I just to observe, I think that is natural. I mean, that is a natural political consequence of fixed-term Parliament bills, that Prime Ministers in the future will feel less pressured to make kind of knee-jerk reshuffles for political effect, because they won't, they might not feel quite as hemmed in by the prospect of an early general election. But that seems to be a natural political consequence rather than a formal decision one needs to take or seek to impose on future Prime Ministers.
Eleanor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Deputy Prime Minister, I wonder whether you might want to take this opportunity to set the record straight on a matter that you have previously answered to the Select Committee, an answer you gave which turned out not to be true. On the 19th of April, when we were talking about, the question was, can we take it that further progress of the boundaries reform legislation is not dependent for its support by your party of the coalition upon the further progress of the House of Lords reform bill? And you said there is no formal link between the two. In a later question, is it the case that the reports that your party's support for further progress on boundaries legislation is dependent upon progress on House of Lords reform legislation are wrong? You said, of course. I've said that, there is no link, of course, there is no link. And a few weeks later, you told the House of Commons that because you had failed to get the House of Lords reform legislation through Parliament, you were withdrawing support for the boundaries legislation. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to set the record straight, because what you told us last time wasn't true.
Well, I'm sorry, I just entirely refute that and take and bridle at the idea that you think I was telling an untruth. Of course there is no formal link. There's no formal legal link between one measure taken by the government, one piece of legislation and another. But I'm totally unambiguous and have never sought to hide the fact. I think clearly there's a political judgment to be made in a coalition, which I made and announced perfectly transparently, that you have to keep the kind of overall balance of the package of measures that you've agreed upon as a coalition in balance. And, I think most people in the country find it perfectly reasonable that when one side of the coalition is not delivering on its side of the package, you can't expect the other side of the coalition to just religiously carry on delivering its side of the bargain. Now, my party, without any complaint at all, has pushed through and voted for political and constitutional reforms which are particularly close to the hearts of the Conservative Party, quite normal in the coalition, whether it's police and crime commissioners, not supported by my party, but we legislated for it and so on. Mayors, actually quite a lot of ambiguity in my party, even individual voter registration, something very much I'm personally very supportive of, but it was, the political emphasis very much came from the other side of the coalition and so on and so forth. I think most people understand that when you then get a real imbalance in that overall package, it is perfectly normal for one side of the coalition to say, well, therefore, we're not duty bound, given that imbalance, just to carry on supporting things that that we don't believe should now be supported. So I stick to my view that there is, of course, no formal individual link between these individual items. That much is obvious. But equally, I find it just kind of common sense to say that in a coalition, the overall balance of the packages of things that we included in the coalition agreement need to be kept in balance. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work.
I didn't ask you either then or now about a formal legal link. We're not a bunch of sixth formers. We're all politicians.
Well, you read out the quote, and I said a formal link then, and so I'm just repeating what I said at the time.
Yes, I understand, and I didn't ask you at the time about a formal legal link either. The question you answered then, as now, was not the question I asked. I have never asked you about a formal legal link because we are all politicians and we know how one uses words. Nobody was ever talking about a formal legal link, but merely about the political link, which you've just explained. So basically what we... of course, your words were true. There is no formal legal link, but the implication of what you said was not true. But much more importantly than what you said to this committee is what you said at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, and that's a different matter. During the second reading of the Parliamentary Voting Systems and Constituencies Bill, you said there are 3 problems with the current electoral map. Constituencies vary too much in size, they are based on information that is out of date, and there are too many of them. At the moment, the will of the voters is not weighed equally. For example, last December, Manchester Central contained 85,000 electors, while Glasgow North had just 50,000 electors, a difference of 41%. On the broken scales of our democracy, 10 voters in Glasgow North have the same weight as 17 voters in Manchester Central. I remember being delighted when you said that, because I totally agreed with you, as most people do. Broken scales of our democracy, you said. And you said it's a simple, straightforward principle of equality that we are shrining in the legislation. Later on, in referring to the number of MPs that we ought to have, number of members of Parliament, you said 600 is about right. And so it goes on. You made it absolutely clear that you considered it important, and you said so at the dispatch box, that we should reduce the number of members of Parliament to 600 and that we should equalise the size of constituencies. Have you actually changed your mind on that?
Well, 2 things. First, I'm glad you've clarified that what I said was not, as you said, you alleged earlier that what I said was not true, and you've now recognised that what I said was true. You may not have been satisfied with the answer, but I'm glad you've clarified on the record that what I said was true, and that was quite different to your first, wholly different and frankly much more serious allegation.
I'm sure you will agree with me, Deputy Prime Minister, that we are all politicians. And you know that the use
I'm
of
sorry,
words
there's a world of difference
something.
between saying to a politician what you said is untrue and saying that the implications, or at least your interpretation of the implications, may have not been consistent with what you wanted to hear. But what I said was true then, and I've just merely repeated it now. This, on the boundaries thing, what I have explained on numerous occasions, for the reasons that I've just rehearsed to you just earlier in answer to your first question, is that I'm not suggesting we repeal the legislation. I'm just suggesting we delay it by a full parliamentary cycle. The coalition agreement didn't attach a timetable to the introduction of changed boundaries, so what I'm proposing is not in contradiction to the both the spirit and the letter of the coalition agreement. The legislation for the boundary reviews and the boundary changes and the cut in the number of MPs remains on the statute book. The disagreement, such as it is that I, for all the reasons I have quite openly explained, do not believe that I can now justify asking my party to support that change coming in before the next general election. And that is why when an amendment emerged in the House of Lords, in a completely different context, to do just that, to roll it forward a full parliamentary cycle, I signalled that was entirely consistent with what I said in August, and that therefore my party would support it. I understand you may not like it, but that I think is an explanation that is reasonable, not in contravention to what the coalition agreement says, and I hope widely understood.
Well, of course, Deputy Prime Minister, it doesn't matter whether I like it or not. That's not the point. The point is your integrity and what you said in the House of Commons at the dispatch box, giving your word about something and then going back upon it. And of course, we're not here to discuss the coalition agreement, and none of us know exactly what happened behind closed doors when it was drawn up. And yes, indeed, you have every right to wriggle out of the exact wording of the coalition agreement. That's what politics is all about. And I'm not questioning that, or your right or your ability to do that. What I am questioning is that you said to the House of Commons that the current setup of constituencies and the way the boundaries are drawn is unfair, and you were emphatic about it. And if it was unfair when you said it at second reading in the House of Commons, it is still unfair now, and yet you are going to say we should go into the next general election with that unfairness still in play.
I'm duty-bound to observe that I think me saying there should be a delay in a reform to the number of MPs in this House and where the boundaries are drawn is I mean, to put it in perspective, you said to your electorate and to your constituents that you were in favour, as a manifesto commitment, of reform of the House of Lords. Now, you know, if we really want to get into a comparative exercise about who has said what to the British public and what has then been delivered, I have said very clearly that I'm not proposing to unpick the legislation which would lead to the boundary reviews. I am merely making a change in what I think should be the timetable for the implementation of that. To me, at least, I think to most observers, that is as nothing compared to saying, on the one hand, solemnly in a manifesto, one is going to say reform the House of Lords, and then not following that through when the opportunity arises in the House of Commons. So, you and I clearly disagree on this, but I think
this is nothing to do with my opinion or a disagreement.
No, but the point of, if I can, just the point of principle you're seeking to make, which the argument you're seeking to make, is that I have somehow done something which is in contradiction to what I said on the floor of the House. Actually, what I said on the floor of the House is I made the principal argument for boundary changes. The mechanism to do so remains on the statute book, but for all the reasons that I've transparently explained, I want to shift the timetable of that change into the next Parliament.
Surely you must recognise that there is a world of difference between an individual Member of Parliament broadly supporting the manifesto that has been drawn up by the leadership of their party and a person in a senior position standing at the dispatch box in the House of Commons and saying one thing and then not following it through. There's a world of difference there.
Well, I can only repeat, I think you're exaggerating the difference, because what I'm saying is that the timing of the implementation of that change is something that I, for all the reasons I've explained, feel should be and will be changed. I'm not arguing with I've never sought to argue with the principle. I've made a perfectly open and transparent political argument about the balance of measures which are being adopted or not followed through in the coalition. My own view, you clearly disagree, my own view is that whilst I of course accept it is now a dead issue, certainly for the time being, my own view is for those many MPs from different parties who committed not just once but in several manifestos over several years to their own constituents to reform the House of Lords, to then not do so when the opportunity arose, struck me then and still strikes me now as quite a serious issue.
I think everyone's now got their positions on the record, so it might be helpful just to move on a little bit into
let us
detail.
Mr. Chairman, let us move on to the matter of House of Lords reform. Can I ask you why does the government believe that no reform is better than a small reasoned degree of reform such as that set out in Lord Steele's bill?
Well, I think two things. Firstly, and you've been very articulate in making this case on a number of occasions, if the argument is right that the public is not interested in this and that you wish the government now to focus on the priority issues of rescuing, repairing, reforming the British economy, then I think it's not really consistent to return, if you like, to this issue and expend any more time on it, given that the House has been very, very clear that it doesn't want to embark on the wholesale reform which we had sought to negotiate on a cross-party basis. That's one point, I guess, just a question of where you expend political time and capital at a time when many people have been saying that we should be devoting our principal energies to the economic issues at hand. Secondly, on the substance of Lord Steele's bill, and of course he and I have spoken about this at length, I think there is no evidence at all that the retirement provisions or the provisions against those who've committed crimes would have any material or significant effect on the size of the House of Lords. I don't think in the terms of its own logic, if you like, the bill delivers what it purports to say on the tin. I mean, for instance, if I were to pass or adopt Lord Steele's bill, and I understand you're keen to do so, it wouldn't actually apply to those who've committed crimes previously. So for all the controversies around those who might or might not re-enter the House of Lords having been convicted, it would have no effect whatsoever. And experience suggests that providing kind of a voluntary option of retirement would be taken up by a very, very small number of members of the House of Lords. So, I think even in terms of its own logic, we just don't believe that analysis and scrutiny suggests that it won't really have the material effect that it's purported to have. And I think, I'll be quite open, there is a sort of, if you like, a stubborn issue of principle, which I don't want to hide from you, which is that the central flaw in the House of Lords as it's presently constituted in the eyes of the government is its lack of legitimacy in the eyes of the British public. And a reform-light approach, which doesn't actually have a material bearing on the overall size of the House of Lords and doesn't really touch on that issue of legitimacy, does not seem to us to be an enterprise, which is something that which we should be spending a lot of time and effort on right now.
But in actual fact, you and I have agreed, strangely, in the past that
it's that strange.
Not strangely
on
at
other
all.
issues, I'm sure.
Not strangely at all. You and I have and many other people have naturally agreed that it is the duty of government and Parliament to do things that don't necessarily strike an interesting chord with the public, because these matters still have to be attended to, and that the sort of discussions we have in this committee, for example, are not going to be exciting to most tabloid newspapers, but nevertheless they are important. And you have argued in the past that that the House of Lords is too big and that there are too many people who are over a certain age. And again, I entirely agree with you on that. So why don't we now take Lord Steele's bill, and if it has imperfections, then amend it so that it's improved, so that my understanding is that if there was a provision, let us say, that people over the age of 80 no longer had voting rights in the House of Lords. Or we're getting the ageist argument here from my honourable friend, which is a fair argument. Well, okay, 85, but supposing it was 80. If people over the age of 80 could continue being peers of the realm and coming into the House of Lords and listening to debates, but no longer had voting rights, or indeed no longer had an office and the costs that are connected with that, 120 people would be gone from the House of Lords just like that. Is that not worth doing?
Well, I think we're in terrible danger of embarking on a sort of role reversal, because you've been reprimanding me for a good 2 years now not to dwell on things that the public don't care about, and now urging me to do quite the reverse. But that entirely friendly, not facetious comment aside, I mean, I think there's considerable interest in our proceedings. I wouldn't do the committee down quite as much as you did earlier, judging by the serried ranks behind me. On the issue of the substance, look, of course, we will continually look with an open mind at proposals which meaningfully reduce the size of the House of Lords and or mean that those who, in a sense, really shouldn't by rights be there do that. But I just the bill as chopped and changed the Lord's Deal Bill. It's been considerably narrowed in scope during its sort of passage in the House of Lords. For all the reasons I've explained, I'll look obviously at the 120 figure that you mentioned. Of course I will look at that. But our view at the moment is that Lord Steele's bill really will not have a material or significant bearing on the total number of members of the House of Lords. In other words, it will not do what it purports to do. Now, you know, as I say, I don't want to. It's not a theological thing. Its great omission is it doesn't deal with the issue of legitimacy, which is where we sort of started from on this whole issue in the first place. But of course, we'll look at any new detail that you have.
So, since most of us do actually believe that the House of Lords does need reform, and you're absolutely right on that, it needs to be reformed. Are you going to keep House of Lords reform on the agenda?
No, I think the attempt at reforming the House of Lords in the way which we had set out in the government bill, that is clearly, you know, as in the proverbial Monty Python parrot, it is dead for the time being. I think it'll have to be returned to, my own view, by future parliaments and future governments, because I think it's a wholly unsustainable and democratically unsustainable state of affairs. But I think for this Parliament, clearly it's not something we're going to return to.
Thank you.
Fabian?
What is democratically unsustainable, Deputy Prime Minister? The number
Well,
of
it's not
MPs.
democratic.
Sorry, the number of MPs in the House of Commons being 650 instead of 600, as you proposed, or the imbalance in the number of electors per constituency?
I'm talking about the House of Lords.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry. You weren't talking about the.
No, I wasn't talking about the House of Commons. I'm talking about the House of Lords.
Okay.
And sorry, on that,
Then-
it's democratically
Okay.
unsustainable because it's not democratic.
Right. So can I then put it to you that the reason that the Electoral Registration and Administration Bill was postponed indefinitely was because of Lord Hart of Chiltern's proposed amendment on day one of the committee stage in the House of Lords, suggesting that the new constituency boundaries not to come into effect until October 2018. Is that why it was postponed, and the two further days 2 and 3 of the committee stage in the House of Lords, due on the 30th and 31st of October, did not then happen?
No, well, I think Lord Strathclyde, the leader of the House, was very open that amendment did then elicit considerable debate and not least consideration of its admissibility and so on. I don't think there's any secret about that. I'm confident now that progress will be made very shortly in finalising the remaining stages for that bill in the House of Lords, and that we will then be able to consider it as amended in the House of Commons. So I think it was quite sensibly the pause button, if you like, was pushed by the authorities in the House of Lords, but I think the play button will be pushed again very soon, and that in the new year, I can't really give you a date yet, we will be able to return to it for our remaining stages and votes on that in the House of Commons.
So can I just be clear then that there will be a further committee stage in
Yes.
the Lords yet to be
Yes.
announced?
Yes.
There will be, you think that Lord Hart's amendment may well go through? Is that what you're saying?
That's for the will of the House of Lords,
Okay.
but
you must have some idea as to whether it will
I
happen
think
or not.
I think it's likely. But the last thing I'm going to do is try and predict
okay.
how the
So-
House of Lords might vote.
And if it does, and then comes back to the House of Commons, will the government then oppose that amendment and seek to reverse it?
Well, clearly there isn't a government position on
Yeah.
this issue for all the reasons that
Exactly.
Mrs. Lang and I have just rehearsed. So you know there won't be a consolidated government position on that one particular aspect if that amendment is included in the bill which comes to us in the House of Commons. As with other areas where the two coalition parties don't see eye to eye, I'm sure we will handle those differences in a grown-up, civilised and transparent way.
Does that not mean, though, given that set of possibilities, that the bill is effectively dead?
No, I don't. And I know Chloe wants to add her own words on this because she's been following the bill very closely. No, I'm very confident that we will get that bill onto the statute book. A considerable amount of work has been done across all parties, actually, here in order to make sure that the bill meets many of the early concerns which were expressed about it. Individual voter registration to clamp down on fraud in our electoral system is something that all parties have agreed. The previous Labour government had its own timetable to introduce individual voter registration. We, as you know, through the bill, wish to bring that timetable forward. And I remain, the Prime Minister remains, we all remain determined to see that on the statute book. Yes, you're right, there's been this pause in the House of Lords for all reasons that you alluded to, but I'm confident now that that pause will give way to further progress such that we can get the bill on the statute book in good order and on time. But I don't know, Chloe, whether you want to answer.
If I may just add, I think, Fabian, you might be being somewhat mischievous by confusing a single amendment with the whole bill. The amendment clearly does seek to deal with quite a different subject matter. Yeah. And I think Lord Strathclyde actually made that very clear in his statements to the other House on admissibility and on the way in which that House would have to deal with that. I share some of his regret, actually, that senior parliamentarians couldn't perhaps have thought about that before they tabled such an amendment. Admissibility, I mean, before they tabled such an amendment. But just as Nick has said, the bill itself, the concept of individual electoral registration is a very important one, and something that the government is extremely keen to see come through, and also something that has wide political support indeed from your party as well.
But presumably the provisions on boundary changes will be dropped from that bill, because you can't have a bill that has boundary changes that go beyond this Parliament, presumably. Or can you?
Well, again, I would just caution that we ought to take things in order. So first of all, let's the bill return to the Lords for its discussion there. Secondly, then we shall deal with it in our own House in due course afterwards. So it's somewhat hard to sit here and speculate on those bases. But it is important to say that as it stands in the bill's current discussion and the point to which the bill has got so far, the boundary legislation is in primary legislation. So there is one legal basis as it stands at present. But it is also important, really important, to just draw out the principle here, which is that if you are dealing with the registration of electors, you do want to have, for example, registers that are, of course, complete and accurate, as we all wish for, comprehensive as well, and you do want those to be firmly based for elections going forwards.
May I just finally, Chairman, can I just ask one or both of you whether you think that thus far the government's constitutional reform agenda has been successful? Because the House of Lords must have been a major plank. Reducing the number of MPs in the House of Commons was one of your major areas of concern, and of course equalisation. You won't have succeeded in any of those three.
No, I tried to be very I hope, fair in my assessment of what I think has gone well and what's not gone so well. In my opening remarks, I think two things stand out. Firstly, that where the public has been asked to either participate in or support change, the response has been less than enthusiastic, to put it mildly. Participation in PCC elections, supporting mayoral elections, the referendum and so on. And secondly, where the issues have touched on what I call the mechanics of power within Westminster, it's very quickly got snarled up in power politics between the parties, and that I think has. So I think those two things are just true. Having said all of that, I really hope we will not underplay the constitutional significance of the fixed-term Parliament Bill. It's really quite, it's something that's bedeviled British politics for a long time. The executive could play cat and mouse with Parliament and the British people. I don't think we should underplay the succession to the Crown Bill, which Chloe is introducing later today, or our determination to press ahead in one shape or form, obviously in the light of the comments made by this committee and others on recall, on lobbying. Strenuous efforts are made to try and find this elusive, or at least hitherto elusive, cross-party approach on party funding. So, and as I stressed, I think if you were to be a political scientist from Mars and land on Britain in 2015, I hope one of the first things you'd notice, that's assuming you'd landed here in 2010, is you'd notice a radical shift of decision-making and power and authority from the centre to the constituent nations and communities and councils of the United Kingdom in a very big way, amounting to literally control over billions and billions and billions of pounds of money that until now have always been kept firmly in the clammy hands of the Treasury. That is a big change. That is a big change in a political system which I think most observers have accepted has been more over-centralised for a longer period of time than almost any other mature democracy in the world.
Thank you, Tristan.
Can I just briefly begin by returning to the House of Lords? Are you in favour of the Prime Minister's plans to pack an already ram-packed second chamber, the largest in Western Europe, with even more peers? And if so, will the Liberal Democrats be nominating their own top-ups to the already jam-packed House of Lords?
Absolutely. Of course we will. We have a coalition agreement commitment that pending reform of the House of Lords, we would seek to make appointments to the House of Lords in proportion to the votes won at the last general election, and I intend to stick to that. I've heard this argument. Which I find
so you don't think it's too full? You think there's space for more people, or is this a kind of sort of Trotskyist vision to destroy it through making it ridiculous,
so that it collapses under the contradiction of its own terms?
Exactly.
So that would be very Machiavellian, as well as Trotskyite, which I wouldn't recommend that's quite a mix. Look,
I think Trotsky
we had a plan to both instill greater legitimacy and constrain the size of the House of Lords. For all the reasons that we don't need to rehearse here, that did not find favour with Parliament. I've heard this argument. I find it deeply eccentric that for some reason, because other people did not agree with the government's plan to deal with this problem, we should somehow then refrain from making future appointments to the House of Lords. I will certainly, as party leader, seek to make appointments to the House of Lords, as I'm entirely entitled to do, until the House of Lords changes. Now, that's the approach we'll take. Of course, I accept there is an issue of size. As I explained earlier, I don't think Lord Steele's bill provides an answer to that. I think the only answer, my own view, you'll be unsurprised, you won't be surprised to hear this, is a wholesale reform along the lines of what we proposed. That's not clearly going to be delivered right now, and in the meantime we will continue with the system of appointment that political leaders have participated in for a very long time.
And how does that square with your attempt to bring down the cost of politics and fix the public finances?
I don't think additional appointments to the House of Lords in line with what we openly and publicly committed in the coalition agreement is going to have a material effect on our ability to get on top of the deficit, as we spend, as a government, over £730 billion of public money a year. And of course it depends on how many appointments are made, and indeed how many appointments the Leader of the Opposition would seek to make in that arrangement as well. So of course everybody would need to explain themselves in that context.
But do you not see any irony between your lofty views, which I approve of, about the decentralisation of power, and we have a situation at Birmingham City Council, at Stoke-on-Trent City Council, at Newcastle City Council, where they are saying that the historic role of local government is about to end, that Newcastle City Council is about to eliminate its entire arts budget, that Birmingham City Council is going to have to close swimming pools and parks and do all the great things that places like Sheffield have done over the last 40 years. And you're saying to local government, we're going to absolutely keep our foot on your throat. The things you have historically achieved are no longer possible. Meanwhile, here in Westminster, fill your boots, let's have more in the House of Lords. We're going to increase the cost and expense down here. Meanwhile, in local government, your museums, your libraries are going to close.
Well, needless to say, I don't accept that characterisation of our approach to local government at all.
Well,
the city, well, no, but it isn't.
It is. Newcastle are closing their libraries and museums.
The Labour Council in Newcastle might have chosen to do that. Other councils have not. That is a political choice by the Labour-led council in Newcastle. And and I see this every day in Sheffield, simply to defer all responsibility for those local decisions and say it is the fault of central government is, in my view, a deeply disingenuous explanation to the people of Newcastle, indeed to the people of Sheffield. I am not denying, of course, that local government is having to endure, as by the way everybody is, unprecedented pressure on the public finances. My own view is that the only way we're going to square the circle as a country, given that we all accept now that a period of scarcity and fiscal restraint is going to continue for many years. And by the way, whoever is in power after 2015 will have to confront a prolonged period of fiscal restraint, the likes of which this country has not seen, perhaps has not seen really since the early 1970s, and certainly not for perhaps even longer back than that. That the only way we're going to square the circle of allowing great cities like Birmingham, Sheffield, Newcastle and others to innovate, to provide services locally, to generate growth and jobs, is to radically decentralise. So the city deal, for instance, that we entered into with Sheffield is worth about £500 million to that great city. It is completely decentralising, in effect, all control over transport, greater control over capital expenditure, including new borrowing powers through tax increment financing, control over skills, so you don't have everything, the whole skills agenda and training for young people and how to get them in jobs run from Whitehall, run from Sheffield. That is, in my view, the only way that in a prolonged period of fiscal restraint that we're going to be able to generate growth locally in the engines of growth in our great cities in the north, and also retain and cherish and celebrate local autonomy, which you're quite right, it has been championed for so long by local councils. You and I are just going to disagree with the politics of blame.
But you're morally happy with increasing the expenditure down in Westminster and cutting it in local government?
As I said,
increase more peers.
Of course, I'm not happy with the fact that we've got an unreformed House of Lords, which is not going to be subject to a vote from the British people. I mean, I'm the chief sponsor of a plan which would have dealt with the problem. Now, you need to explain to me why it was, for instance, that your party chose not, despite all the pious statements in favour of House of Lords reform, that when the opportunity was there to do...
for it.
You might have done, Tristan, but you know as well as I do, there was a wholly political, that's fine, we're all politicians, but deeply cynical approach by Labour, which was to pay lip service to House of Lords reform, but not do anything to really deliver it when the opportunity was there. I chaired, as you know, meetings for a year with a sort of moving cast of Labour politicians to try and elicit a cross-party approach to this. To now be told, because the Labour Party and others failed to back a proposal which would have dealt with the spiralling costs of politics and would have helped to legitimise the House of Lords, I would have helped to cut the numbers. Because of that, somehow it's my responsibility to remedy that. My head's starting to spin. At the slightly sort of lopsided logic of all of this.
Okay. When it comes to tax increment financing versus business rate localisation, I mean, tax increment financing was a very good Labour Party policy, which was introduced. Do you have a fear that if you have, as it were, the full liberalisation of business rates, that places like I represent and you represent versus places like the City of London, actually the sort of the good which we want to achieve in terms of financial autonomy of local government and self-sustainability is going to be potentially undone by just the extraordinary economic inequalities which exist in the UK, i.e. they're simply not going to get the funds in terms of their local business rates to deliver the kind of services that they need at local government level?
No, I totally accept that if you localise, decentralise control over money, in whatever shape or form that comes, retention of business rates, tax increment financing, consolidated capital pots, which is something we've also done, which again is very, very useful to areas like the area that you represent and I do as well. If you do that, the danger always is if the money that is generated to fund those things has to be generated in full locally, then of course the problem is you get increasing inequality because you get you just end up chasing your tail because it's those parts of the country that can least generate that money that most need it. And that's why what we do, and most sort of federated fiscal systems around the world do this in one shape or form. If you look at Germany, look at the United States and so on, is you strike a balance between the retention of locally generated money with some form of redistribution in order to make sure that the wealthier parts of a nation continue to distribute money to those that need it most. And that's why we have on local business rates said that, at least in the first instance, the proportion of the business rates retained locally is about half. Now, the purists would argue it's got to be 100%. I think if you were to do that in one foul swoop, you'd run into the trouble that you allude to. I only, by the way, firstly, I just slightly correct you. Actually, the ability to borrow money under the tax increment finance scheme, as we've sort of in a sense sought to copy from North America, where it's been most actively pioneered, so that you borrow money in anticipation of future receipts generated by capital investment, is not something which was introduced by the previous government. But putting that just factual point aside, on business rates, I don't know what the figures are for your neck of the woods, but certainly for Sheffield and the other big cities of the north, given that the whole point of this is to provide an incentive to local councils to attract business and to become, at the moment, as you know, councils have no incentive at all to actually make their local community more attractive to businesses because they don't retain any of the revenue. Actually, business growth in those areas has increased quite substantially in recent years. So the business rate revenue, if it had been localised over the last 5-10 years, would have increased dramatically for almost all of those areas.
We hope on our local government paper we may have some answers for you on some of those knotty questions, Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Flynn, 10 minutes.
Do you think I'll ask the question briefly and possibly brief answers because a number of subjects I want to raise. But do you think that the police and crime commissioners' jobs now is so degraded in the eyes of the public that the first election is likely to be the last election on the grounds of the derisory turnout and the shameless cronyism by the commissioners in appointing their pals as deputies?
I think it's just an obvious point. They've really got their work cut out. They've really got their work cut out to now prove that they're a worthwhile addition to the policing and political landscape.
Okay, thanks. St. Augustine said in his prayer as a young man...
Sorry?
St. Augustine. Yes, I'm sure you're very familiar with the lives of the saints. But he prayed as a young man, God make me chaste, but not yet. Yeah. We'll have a bill in the next half an hour going through the House, which will have the support, I think, of everyone in the country, suggesting we get rid of gender from the succession. Why doesn't it apply immediately?
Shall I? May I take this one, Paul? And I certainly hope it's not in the next half hour, because in which case I need to be down in the chamber.
Okay.
You'll have to let me go from your committee in order to go and do that. But Paul, the answer to your question is actually that the agreement is that actually it will apply retrospectively, dated back to the Commonwealth Heads of Government in Perth last year.
So it'll apply to the next succession that comes up. So to the unfortunate demise of the Queen.
Oh, I beg your pardon, I'm misunderstanding you. I'm sorry. You're referring to Prince Charles as opposed to the baby of Prince William. I see. Because I think in simple terms, because you do have to sort of plan ahead, as it were. So we're planning ahead to the next generation.
If it's a reform, why do we have to wait decades until it applies? I mean, everyone agrees that it shouldn't be done on the basis of gender. Well, why not do it straight away?
Because in this area of constitutional reform, I think it's fair to look to a generation to come. The Palace is content to move forward to this generation, and that is a reasonable agreement with which to move forward.
So God make me free of gender discrimination, but not yet. The House of Lords, the House of Commons at the moment, has changed over the last 20 years, so that it represents the country in the way that there are more women there, not enough, and more ethnic minorities there, not enough. But it doesn't have a single octogenarian there. And isn't this a major defect in view of the outrageous ages of my colleague? But shouldn't we have people in the House of Commons who remember what life was like before there was a health service?
Well, may I, as at one point in my career the youngest MP, and indeed now the youngest government minister, I suppose I ought to answer that from the other end of the scale. I've always said that we need people from all walks of life, and that means young and old as well as every other axis in the Commons. St. Augustine, if I were to use him on this side of the argument, I suppose would look to time to do its work, and some people will say that time ticks on, and those who may be 78 now could look forward to being 80. But I'll do as others have just done, could suggest that the Father of the House is doing an admirable job.
Indeed, yes. I think I'm being, there's question here. I believe that there was a situation a short while ago. There are a few, there are about 5 over 77. There might be 1 or 2 who've had birthdays recently that might well be be
we
over
wish them
80.
all a long and flourishing life and a happy
But
birthday.
are you really happy about a bill that will have a cull of the elderly in the House of Lords in this outrageous way that we've heard this morning?
I think Nick
Another
answered
reason why the
those.
Lords do the bill might not carry all the favour that Eleanor wishes, but...
Okay, I'll stick to my brief. I mean, don't you think that when we talk about defects in democracy, and I think you deserve credit for many of the things that you've listed this morning of the attempts to make, that the outrageous injustice in our democracy is the cheat or first past the post?
Oh, don't get me onto that.
Oh, come on.
You don't want to invite a Liberal Democrat to talk about the virtues of electoral reform. We'll be here all day. I mean, short answer is yes.
Thank you. I'm very good. Okay, thank you.
Very quick one, David, because I'm trying to get
on the
colleagues
issue
in.
of the PCC elections. Deputy Prime Minister, on the 16th of November, I was driving back from the count in Huddersfield for the West Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner elections, when I heard you on the radio saying that the reason the turnout was generally lower than 14%, 13.7 in West Yorkshire, was because people were disillusioned and apathetic in the mid-term of a parliament. And I just wanted to put to you the other reasons that I got on the doorstep over the two-week period that I campaigned with our candidate, which were these. Firstly, we didn't have the chance to decide by referendum whether we wanted this post or not, unlike the mayoralty. Secondly, you're politicising the police, and we're totally against this. And thirdly, because we didn't get a sort of free post delivery of an election manifesto as we do at a general election, we didn't know anything about any of the candidates. Now, surely they're the main reasons, and that's borne out by the number of spoiled ballots.
Well, I certainly don't want to pretend that I have the monopoly of wisdom on explaining why people didn't vote, and I'm sure there are, if you like, some mechanical issues that we need to look at just as much as the comment I was making on the wider mood towards politics generally. And the Electoral Commission, of course, is conducting a review into how the elections were held. I mean, I've heard lots of different rival explanations. People say it's because of a lack of free post, or the weather was bad, or it was a long time. Yeah, I mean,
No, but it was more anger than disillusion, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, look, I'm not pretending that I've got some sort of scientific proof to show you that my assertion is right. I hope to think it's, or rather, sadly, I think it is a fairly uncontested observation at the moment that for all reasons that we've been talking about already this morning, that when the public is being asked to participate in new elections or support the election of new posts, they tend not to be very interested. As I say, I think we shouldn't derive from that a pessimistic conclusion that says that we should try to do nothing to improve the quality of our democracy. I think that would be exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. But we do need to be realistic and modest and humble enough to say, well, maybe the way which we're going about trying to reconnect the public to politics is not working. And that's why I do think that linking constitutional political reform to the things that most people care about most of the time, which is generating jobs, generating growth, generating prosperity, is essential, certainly in the coming period.
I've got to get other people in. Sorry, I'll bring you back at the end if I have time. The DPM's got to go at 10:30. Chris.
Can I just ask, has the Ministerial Code's requirement for collective responsibility been explicitly set aside since May 2010?
Not to my knowledge.
So anything that's being done by ministers and the government in breach of the collective responsibility is in breach of the Ministerial Code?
Well, you can't respect the Ministerial Code in that respect unless you first arrive at collective agreements. You can't exercise collective responsibility in the absence of collective agreements. And clearly in a coalition government, if the two coalition parties do not agree, we do not have a collective position, and therefore it is not reasonable to expect ministers to defend a position collectively which has not been arrived at collectively.
But you seem to be walking away from the explicit terms of the Ministerial Code, which sets out the requirement of collective responsibility.
But only on the basis of collective positions.
No, it also says the principle of collective responsibility, save where it is explicitly set aside, applies to all government ministers. And you say it has never been explicitly set aside, so you are rewriting the ministerial code.
No, I don't accept that for a moment. You can't exercise collective responsibility, just logical. You can't exercise collective responsibility unless you have something upon which to exercise that responsibility in the first place. And in the absence of collectively agreed positions and policies, there is nothing there's nothing around which collective responsibility can be organised.
But paragraph 2.1 of the Ministerial Code sets out the general principle, and it says that it requires that the privacy of opinions expressed in Cabinet and ministerial committees, including in correspondence, should be maintained. And that's because that's in accordance with the principle of collective responsibility that requires that ministers should be able to express their views frankly in the expectation that they can argue freely in private while maintaining a united front when decisions have been reached. So basically, the whole principle of collective responsibility has been torn up, hasn't it? I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
The clues are in the last four words, when decisions are reached. And when a decision is not reached, clearly you cannot adopt a collective position. Where positions are arrived at collectively, of course I agree with you that it is incumbent upon governments of whatever composition to seek to explain those and deliver them and implement them collectively. But as the Ministerial Code says, as you've just read out yourself, when decisions are reached. If a decision is not reached, you cannot apply collective discipline to a decision which hasn't been agreed collectively.
So you would say that the line that you are taking with your members of Parliament and Cabinet colleagues from the Liberal Democrat Party in relation to a boundary change implementation, that is not in breach of the Ministerial Code?
No, because what we agreed as a government in the coalition agreement was to legislate on the boundary changes, which we've done. I have not, as I explained to Eleanor earlier, I have not at one moment suggested we unpick that primary legislation, but I have, in line with the coalition agreement, said there should be a change to the implementation timetable. I think no one could argue that is somehow in contravention of the collective agreement which we reached in the coalition agreement. By contrast, if one wants to be really pedantic about this, the collective undertaking, public collective undertaking, to deliver House of Lords reform, undertaken in the name of both the coalition parties, the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties, was not delivered, amongst others, by the parliamentary party of the Conservative Party. That, in a sense, is a greater breach of a collective undertaking that we have made publicly on that issue than changing the timetable of the implementation of the boundary.
But the collective responsibility applies to ministers and not to members of Parliament from different parties. I think you misunderstand the principle of collective ministerial responsibility. Can I try one more example on you? The recent autumn statement. That must have been a joint decision by the Cabinet to approve the contents of the autumn statement. Immediately after it, we had the Business Secretary criticising various aspects of the autumn statement in public. Was that not a breach of the Ministerial Code?
He didn't actually criticise the decisions arrived at. He defended them valiantly. He criticised, and I think he was perfectly entitled to do so, language which was used to describe certain provisions in it where he did not agree with the language used by the Chancellor. Now, I think the decisions that were arrived at painstakingly and collectively, have been painstakingly and collectively defended and explained since. But, I don't think one can ever suggest that the Ministerial Code, this would be deeply illiberal, also constrain what adjectives and adverbs people use.
So, I know it doesn't refer to bigots in the Ministerial Code, so I take that point, but surely the whole idea
What's that got to do with the autumn statement?
Because you're talking about adjectives, okay, or noun, and bigots are actually a noun, but which I think you mistakenly wanted to use in a speech and then decided...
No, I didn't. Can I just... Sorry, I'm not... Sorry, I'm very keen to take all questions. I'm not prepared to accept unchallenged various aspersions which are simply untrue. As I made clear at the time, I would never have used that word. I don't believe that word is right in debate. I had no intention of using that word, and I was extremely annoyed that word was ascribed to me, as I explained in letters to both the leader of the Catholic Church in this country and to Rowan Williams. So if you don't mind, I'd rather that we don't sort of reinvent the facts when recalling them.
Okay, so obviously you took disciplinary action against the person who put that in your speech.
Of course, I made sure that will never happen again.
So going back to the Ministerial Code, the principle of collective responsibility, save where it is explicitly set aside, applies to all government ministers. You say that still applies?
I'm afraid we're just going to go round and round in circles. You can only apply the Ministerial Code in terms of collective responsibility on the basis of decisions reached, as the Ministerial Code makes explicit itself. So where in a government, and certainly, and perhaps most especially in a coalition government, there is no collective decision to defend collectively, it is entirely unreasonable to expect collective responsibility to be applied to something which hasn't been agreed by everybody.
Okay. And so, finally, the gay marriage, is that the subject of an agreement to which there is going to be collective responsibility applied?
Well, the government, as the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport made clear yesterday and the day before, earlier in this week, has made clear that it is the government's view that we should now proceed with this legislation. And of course, whilst that's the government's position, the Prime Minister's equally made clear that he believes it should be subject to a free vote. It's a very controversial issue. I think it's quite atypical, and I think it's pragmatic and sensible to respond to it in that way by reflecting those free vote positions as far as the Conservative Party is concerned in the final vote,
including for ministers.
Well, that is a matter for the Prime Minister and indeed for the ministers concerned, and I don't know whether Chloe can elaborate on that, but I accept that on an issue like that there are very, very strong feelings where some people feel that as a matter of conscience they cannot support it, and I think it's right not to force people who feel it is a matter of conscience into a corner.
So that's an area where the principle of collective responsibility has or may be explicitly set aside.
Well, it's not new that on issues that people consider to be a matter of conscience and of sort of personal morality, that we have a parliamentary and a government system that is pragmatic and fluid enough to allow that to be reflected in the decisions that are made, even if the government of the day makes a proposal to the Parliament of the day. I mean, we have this in a number of areas, sensitive areas of public policy. The government of the day might need to take a position, but it nonetheless does so in the spirit of respect towards those who feel it impinges on strongly held personal and moral views.
How is the talks going on party finance?
They're going. I hope that, of course, they will. They've had 6 meetings of the group, and so you have representatives of each of the 3 main parties appointed by the party leaders. I think we're now getting relatively soon to the point where we have to sort of decide, look, you've been sitting in this room together now, have you really come up with a collective view about how to proceed on this or not? So sometime in the new year, I will seek to say to the group, look, now tell us what are the fruits of your deliberations, and then we'll see whether it's white or black smoke, so to speak. It's something which has eluded the political elite in this country for years and years and years. No party has an unblemished record in all of this. We're all going. I think it's just as night follows day. There are going to be future party funding scandals. We've all made solemn manifesto declarations to try and clean this up. The coalition government in our coalition agreement said we would take measures to get big money out of politics. I think it's in our collective interests to make progress, but I'm not going to hide the fact that, of course, every party may have reasons why they don't welcome change, and I hope we'll be big and brave enough to overcome those reservations this time, because I really, really just don't think it does any of us collectively any good in the long run to be as over-reliant as parties are on big money in whatever, for whatever discipline, whether trade unions or individual donors, and I hope we can move on. Christopher Kelly's committee put forward a number of proposals, which was, of course, the fodder, if you like, the basis upon which the cross-party talks have been established, and we will see in the new year whether we can come up with a consensual approach.
Please let us know if we can help.
Well, maybe you should go into that negotiating room and sort it all out. But,
if you want to make a serious offer, I'm sure the committee would consider
it wasn't meant seriously.
It may be. That's a pity, because we are concerned, and we have been to see Sir Christopher Kelly, and we have expressed our own view that this needs to be dealt with urgently. And failing to deal with it, I think we would want to take another view, and we'd like to be engaged in a positive and constructive way to bring these talks to a successful conclusion. Andrew.
City deals. You said, I think, a moment or two ago that Sheffield gets £500 million from the government, and it will then be able to it will then be able to put that wherever it decides. I feel rather left out because I'm not from a city. We are supposedly in some lap is it, with Portsmouth and Southampton, but those are obviously on the mainland. Where does the money come from for organisations like mine?
Sure. Well, the first thing I should stress is the £500 million figure, and I'm very happy to write to you separately if you like to detail that figure, is based on a number of funding streams which are being, if you like, dramatically consolidated, and how can I put it, the kind of the strings which are traditionally attached to them from central government are just being released, so that, in a sense, what one is providing to the big cities, Sheffield is not the only one, we've entered into city deals with 8 cities, is control over a sort of consolidated pot of money, and indeed greater freedoms to borrow themselves for capital investment they previously did not enjoy. But I will, of course, write separately to you to set that out in detail. The reason we started with the cities are for perfectly rational economic reasons. The big cities in this country are where a lot of people live, where a lot of businesses are located, where we have the conjuncture, if you like, of innovative businesses and universities. So it is a logical place to start providing greater freedom and greater resources to innovate in those areas where you have the kind of economies of scale, and where we know from our own history that these are the cities that created so much prosperity in the first place. In many ways, this is not a newfangled idea. This is actually going back to the, dare I say it, to the kind of traditions of Chamberlain's Birmingham, where you know, Birmingham, in and of its own accord, under its own steam, quite literally, was able to pioneer new industrial and economic revolutions in this country and indeed in the world. The point I want to make is that it's not the end of the story. So what we're doing now is we've set out a prospectus to 20 other areas, including, I think, Norwich, is that right? Which have been logically selected according to 2 criteria. Firstly, the next set of towns and cities in terms of population size, and also a handful of places outside London and the southeast where growth, where growth potential appears to be the highest. And we've got this list of 20 areas which we've set out, and we've said, please come forward with your ideas about how to construct your own city deals to those 20 areas, and then we'll decide which ones will be granted new city deals of that 20. But my point to you, and I think it'd be very, it'd be great if this is something you felt that you would want to sort of pick up the cudgels on, is to try then beyond that, see how we can extrapolate that approach in a way which is more widespread across the country. Because I think the premise of your question, I entirely agree with you. There's no. This shouldn't just be an urban phenomenon. That would be wrong. It's just logical for the reasons that I've explained that we should start there. But it's certainly not the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination.
But you are saying we are putting money, instead of here with the support, the wrong word, but with the support of government, we are putting the same amount of money in direct to the cities.
Yeah, I should be absolutely clear. We're not sadly enough. We haven't identified a pot of gold in Whitehall where we can provide new resources. What we're doing is radically reconfiguring the control over existing resources and consolidating them. And in our view, the material effect of that is very considerable indeed. I mean, capital expenditure is a very good example. For years and years and years, local communities and cities in this country had to go, cap in hand to Whitehall, just to put a single spade in the ground. It was just absurd. Every single bit of capital money was allocated to the nth degree. And in effect, what we've done is just consolidated that into one big single consolidated capital pot. Manchester, by the way, is doing the most radical thing of all. They came forward with an incredibly innovative idea in their bid for a city deal. I think they call it the earn back scheme. And in effect, what that means is that Manchester borrows, I can get the figures for you, I think about £1.2 billion or so of extra money of their own accord, prudentially, to invest in capital transport projects. And we have agreed that the revenue generated from those capital projects do not need to be, or a large part of them, do not need to be returned to the Treasury in the normal way. They can be retained by Manchester, in fact the councils of Greater Manchester, for ongoing reinvestment in transport infrastructure. I think if that works, and we'll see in the next few years whether it does, it could become the model of something we should be doing around the country. And Chloe was at the Treasury when a lot of this was put together. I really do want to pay tribute to George Osborne and his team for doing something that traditionally Treasury ministers have never been prepared to do, which is actually to let go of the purse strings in quite a big way.
Okay, Birmingham, what I think worries us is, will we be included,
yes,
either in the future or now? Birmingham has had Burton-on-Trent included. Now, Burton-on-Trent is quite a long way from Birmingham. And I wonder why Burton-on-Trent is in that.
Yeah.
And secondly, are they getting a fair share of that money? Or is it spent...
Is Burton-on-Trent getting a fair share?
Yes.
Right.
Or,
so that specific point I just simply can't answer. No. In a sense, you need to ask Burton-on-Trent. The reason why we took a very open approach with the cities. We said, look, here's the sort of cupboard of Whitehall powers and resources. You tell us which ones you want to use, which ones you want to deploy, which ones you want to draw down. We're not going to micromanage how you do that. But, we said, it is all the evidence from elsewhere, in North America, parts of Europe and so on, is that if you can act as a sort of, it's not quite the right word, but act more as a city region rather than just a constrained urban area, you tend to get much bigger bangs for your bucks in terms of investment, economies of scale, and crucially, you get politicians from different parties and different local authorities pulling in harness in the same direction. So one of the hidden virtues of the city deal process, and you certainly hear that if you speak to the local authority leaders from different parties who came to make their pitch for the Greater Manchester area, is that it's actually acted as a catalyst for cross-party working locally that we haven't seen for a very long period of time. And if you go to Leeds, you speak to the leaders of Bradford and Leeds. I think, Fabian, I hope you'll confirm this. They think it's been one of the really unusual experiments in Bradford and Leeds for once putting aside their traditional rivalries in order to bid for the city deals. Likewise, many of the local authorities in the Greater Manchester area.
But you're still micromanaging their council tax. I mean,
the level of control by DCLG on the minutiae of council tax in terms of fiscal autonomy is absurd.
Look, as I said before, I think I personally believe that the kind of momentum is towards ever greater fiscal tax devolution. I just before you say, it's always the case. I've discovered this in government. You do anything, and one people holler you're doing too much, and another lot holler you're not doing enough. But the localisation of business rates, combined with the approach on tax increment financing, combined with the retention, the control over central government grants, with the exception of a few areas, particularly in the field of education, put that together collectively, that is a really big shift in the dial towards greater tax devolution. But I totally accept your point, there's still some way to go. And what I hope is emerging, almost imperceptibly actually, is an increasing cross-party consensus that journey will have to continue, kind of regardless of whoever's in power in future. And that I think maybe in 20, 30 years' time, people will look back and say, actually, one of the big things that changed was a real letting go of central control in the UK, which I think in the long run can only benefit us all.
Again, I hope we will not holler but gently whisper some helpful suggestions when we come to produce our
Gently whisper.
local government paper shortly. Andrew, I don't think you'd finished.
Could I just ask you on access to elected officials? How many people have applied so far? How many applications have been successful? Were there any applications in the police elections? And does the government plan to take any other steps to support people with disabilities who wish to become MPs or councillors?
If you've got the figures, Chloe can...
For me to answer. I think you're referring to the access to elected office strategy, which we're very proud to have been able to bring forward. I think we all share a real keenness to see disabled people playing their proper part in political life. There have been 11 applications so far, which follows the PCC elections and by-elections, so I think that's the number you're seeking. Very happy to give more detail on that if the committee would like it at any time.
Okay.
Thank you. We've been very pressed for time this morning, so there are a number of follow-up things. Mrs. Lang has suggested one to me. I know that Mr. Flynn has a couple on lobbying. If we may write to you and get a reply, because other witnesses are now arrived and with us. Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Smith, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
Thank you, colleagues. And we're going to move straight on to our next inquiry, which is about reshuffles. And the first witness we're going to hear from is the Right Honourable Charles Clark. Thank you, Chloe. Apologies, Eleanor and Paul. We'll get those. I will write personally. Can you just give me some words, Eleanor? I will.
It's not worth writing about.
Okay. Hi, Charles. How are you?
Hi, Graham. How are you
Good
doing?
to see you. Welcome.
What are your jacket's rules?
Oh, take your jacket off.
If you let a fake do it, anybody do it.
No.
White tie.
Having been in the chamber accidentally and on a Friday not wearing a tie and being told that I wasn't allowed to speak because I was in a state of undress by the then speaker, the rules are different here. Charles, welcome. It's really good to see you back in the House. Welcome.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You know our inquiries about the concept of reshuffles and what we should be doing about that. Would you like to kick off with an opening statement, Charles? We've got half an hour, and I'm keen.
I don't have an opening statement, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any questions the committee has.
Great. Okay. In that case, I will go straight away to our first questioner, which I think is Fabian.
Thank you, Chairman. Charles, great to see you here. We've been taking quite a bit of evidence on this subject, and it's been entertaining, to say the least, at times. And one of the best bits of evidence we got was from Chris Mullin last week, actually. He told us that he thought that 2 years was the minimum amount of time, really, that a minister needed to be left in the post to be effective and get to know the job that he or she was supposed to be doing. And from your own experiences as a minister, I mean, I know you had sometimes less than 2 years in a particular post. Would you agree with Chris?
Basically, yes. I mean, my fundamental view is for the major departments of state, the big complicated ones, a year is an absolute minimum to basically get up to speed with what's going on and to grasp the issues. That applies to about 5 or 6 of the major government departments. It doesn't apply to all the cabinet posts. Some are less pressing. And the point which I think is often not appreciated is there are 2 types of cabinet ministers. The cabinet ministers who are essentially the political jobs, Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Chief Whip, Leader of the House, and so on, Chair of the Party. And then there are the cabinet posts which are running government departments, and they require different types of skills. And the considerations, which I'm sure Chris was referring to there, and which I would agree with, extend really to the big running of department jobs as opposed to the political jobs, if I can put it like that. But I think you need at least a year to get hold of a department like Education or Home when I was there.
Thanks for that. Do you think, though, that there should be better methods by which the performance and effectiveness of ministers is assessed? I'm not quite sure who would do that, of course, but...
well, there are all kinds of rumours, and I don't know to what extent they're true, that the Prime Minister received briefings on ministerial quality from the permanent secretaries of the departments concerned, from the Whip's office, the Chief Whip in particular, referring to obviously to parliamentary performance, and probably also would take into account media performance, since that's also an important part of a minister's job these days. Now, I don't know to what extent that's actually true, in the sense that there were formal reports, because I was never in a position to see it, but I certainly think it's credible. And I've heard too many anecdotes not to believe them, of ministers being appointed, even to senior cabinet posts, against the view of the permanent secretary, of the cabinet secretary, based on the view of how that individual performed in office at a different area. So I think it's likely there is such a kind of reporting system that goes into place. A big issue for any party leader is whether they're going to basically promote on the basis of talent or on the basis of political balance. Classically, if you think back to the Harold Wilson days, for example, there was a constant issue of balance between the left and right in the party. And I don't think that's ignoble. I don't think politics is a purely managerial task. And as the job of the Cabinet is to maintain the confidence of the whole of the parliamentary party to carry its legislation, that requires having people in government who, broadly speaking, have the confidence of elements of the parliamentary party. So you can't do it on a pure talent-based approach. So I think a Prime Minister is bound to take into account all of these considerations, but I certainly think performance is one of them, and a pretty important one, and one which is sometimes undervalued.
Given that, should it not be more transparent if there are those assessments made of the Minister in Office or the Secretary of State?
I don't really think so. I'm not a great virtue. I mean, I know that this committee is leading the way in the battle for transparency in government, but I'm not myself a tremendous advocate of transparency in these things. I think that people have to be able to make candid judgments. When we were told, when we passed the Freedom of Information Act, that this would guarantee the possibility of private policy assessments being made and people could confidently discuss their situation in confidence, that proved not to be the case. When you add to that the villainies done by the diarists of various descriptions who tell their own version of truth to history, and the collapse of the Cabinet Office control of ministerial memoirs and so on, so that there no longer exists effectively a system which is a constraint. I don't know, I just don't think any of this has benefited good government, and I don't think making transparent, for example, the Chief Whip's assessment of the Secretary of State's performance in the House of Commons would do any good in any direction.
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Charles.
Charles, I mean, looking back at your time both within the last Labour government and your sort of broader political prehistory, do you think Tony Blair was particularly bad at reshuffles in terms of frequency and sort of chaos?
Basically, yes, I do think that, and I think his government could have gone on longer if he'd been better at it, and it would have been better government and better for the country, and also actually better for Tony Blair. I think he suffered. All these things are very personal. They're all prime ministerial judgments, and I think one of the difficulties for your committee in making this assessment is to try and generalise across a series of very different circumstances and personalities. One of Tony's weaknesses was that he thought that most of what was done in government came from number 10 and number 11 Downing Street, and he thought that essentially he could make things happen by his own strength of will and his own leadership. I think that was partly a consequence of him not having held Cabinet Office before being Prime Minister, and he believed he could drive it forward, and therefore it wasn't absolutely essential to be sure that he had the cabinet that he wanted in all respects, and I think that he betrayed that in the way he went. So that meant that when he thought it was okay to reshuffle relatively quickly. In the case of some very important portfolios, he was basically a fatalist. I mean, he reshuffled transport almost incessantly. And I remember him saying to me at one point, he thought there was nothing you could do about transport. Ministers couldn't do anything, and therefore there wasn't much point. And that's where you were. His big subjects were education, health, crime. He thought were the issues you really could make a difference. But so if you didn't think you could make much difference, then it didn't really matter who was the minister at any given time, from his point of view. So I thought he had too grand a view from that, in that sense. On the other hand, of course, politics has changed dramatically since Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and has moved much more to the centre in that way. So his position, his outlook wasn't irrational or silly, if I can put it like that. But I think he changed far too much, and more than he need have done so.
And do you think there's any way to, as it were, institutionalise a sort of more considered programme of reshuffles, or ultimately are you dependent upon, you know, the character of the individual? And we've seen with our current Prime Minister, who has clearly learnt the lessons from the past, you know, is slightly more considered about when this happens in terms of the fixed term parliament, or are you simply dependent upon the personality of the Prime Minister and their own, you know, inclination?
Well, I mean, you're a historian, so you would have gone back through history and seen how this has operated. But fundamentally, reshuffles happen because of political change and the desire of the Prime Minister to reshape his or her team in a way that can better meet what the country is looking for and boost the party's electoral prospects at the next general election. I don't see how that ever changes. You have some events that come along, obviously, sadly, sometimes death. You've got scandals which you decide whether you're going to resist or not, but at the end of the day, somebody may decide to resign and just go out of the blue, as it were. And I don't really see how you legislate for that. You simply have to have a state of mind which says reshuffles aren't that good a thing. I think there's an additional sub-cabinet level reshuffle problem, which is that many permanent secretaries, indeed the whole civil service, focuses itself entirely on the cabinet member, and the junior ministers are seen as rather marginal figures by the civil service often. They'd probably deny what I'm saying, but I believe it to be true from my own time as a junior minister as well. And so the junior ministers become, relatively speaking, adornments to the body politic, rather than themselves decision takers in that area. And I think that's a very bad thing, because I think particularly with the large government departments, you need ministers, I don't know, of immigration or of policing or whatever it may be, or secondary education or higher education, who are really big figures. David Willetts is a good example in this government as a Minister for Higher Education, who's well respected in the sector because he's been there for a while. He stayed through the reshuffle, and he's thought to be at least, if he doesn't agree with everybody, at least people think he's listening to and understands what they're about. And I think for a stable government more generally, there are a whole range of those Minister of State roles which are quite important for a wide range of stakeholders, where permanence is very important. I read Chris's diaries. Chris, of course, has the additional factor, if you're talking about anything in the foreign policy field, or indeed anything which requires significant EU activity, that there's massive benefit in knowing your counterparts in other countries and other governments. I mean, completely enormous. I was very struck in all our EU business when I was Home Secretary during our presidency of the EU, personally knowing the other Home Office ministers and being able to talk to them and deal with them is a very substantial asset if you're trying to pursue British government interests in those areas. And obviously, if you've never met them before, you can't know them. So I think you should try and institutionalise permanence as far as you can down through the system, but it requires some changes of attitude. I admired David Cameron's decision when he said he was going not to try and make changes. I thought that was good. He just had problems with the quality of his cabinet ministers, which led to problems for him to have to deal with.
And in terms of the autonomy of Secretaries of State, what role should there be a role for Secretaries of State, as it were, in choosing their team? My colleague, Mr. Chope, spoke very interestingly about how Mrs. Thatcher allowed, as it were, a certain sort of ideological caucus in different ministries, because she thought that was the best way to achieve change within that, rather than having the kind of sort of man marking and the yin and the yang of left and right within each department.
Well, certainly when I was Secretary of State, the Prime Minister did talk to me about the changes he was going to make in the department before he did so, and I would regard that as normal good managerial practice. It sounds rather bureaucratic description, but I think that's what one should do. I dislike intensely the practice which some governments have had, Tony Blair's less than most, but even his in some cases, of putting somebody in as a number 2 or number 3 to mark in the football sense the Secretary of State. I think that takes you down. It just institutionalises conflict. The civil service doesn't know where it stands, the public doesn't know what's going on. And I think that's a very bad state of affairs. You will always have differences in government, rightly so. It's ridiculous for people under the cloak of collective responsibility to suggest that differences of opinion or practice don't exist. They do. But the thing is to be reasonably open about that. I think it's perfectly reasonable for people to have different views about the size of the prison population or whatever. And that's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have. And I think if you actually institutionalise conflict, that makes it very difficult. In Tony's case, the most famous example, I suppose, was that of Frank Field in the Department of Welfare and Pensions. And that was an experiment which didn't succeed. From that, he either should have made Frank Secretary of State to carry through what he thought and believed, or he should have not had him in the department. He shouldn't have had a position where it was a kind of institutionalised conflict. There are enough institutionalised conflicts in government anyway, just because I mean just the departmental issue, Treasury versus the rest, or whatever it might happen to be. And I think you should be minimising that rather than maximising it.
Finally, just in terms of your own reflections, in terms of the processes of government and the machinery of government, how disruptive was, as it were, it seemed to be sort of annual reshuffle season in terms of getting the business of government done?
I think it was very disruptive. People didn't know where they stood and how they operated. I don't think it was disruptive in terms of the day-to-day business of government, because the briefs were there, parliamentary questions were answered, decisions were taken, mostly. Some of the big decisions might be delayed, but the general atmosphere of freneticism that was about, I think, is very unhealthy, particularly in Parliament. I always hated Julys in Parliament, with the combination of the imminent reshuffle plus the alcohol on the terrace, leading to a state of mind which was extremely unhealthy at all kinds of levels. And I don't think that's a good state of affairs. I think if you had a regular routine time, it was always such and such time, perhaps it would be better, but I'm pretty sceptical about that as well. You should never underestimate the impact of politics on all this. With local council elections in May or European elections in June or whatever it happened to be, that was also a factor in reshuffles, simply because it was a question of trying to find a process of explaining what had happened in that election, and the reshuffle might be a means of dealing with that.
If you view the Prime Ministership as an unelected presidency, where everything is controlled from number 10, aren't you actually looking for safe pairs of hands who will do pretty much what the centre tells them, rather than people with merit or strong opinions and difficult people to manage?
I don't believe the Prime Ministership is an elected presidency. I think it's been overwritten generally. I think some Prime Ministers believe it's an elected presidency, and that can lead to their downfall. I think you actually, the implication behind your question, I agree with completely. You need to have strong individuals who are able to carry political authority in their own right, earn respect in their own right, not simply for their parliamentary performances, but because of their beliefs and positions. What was the book about Abraham Lincoln's cabinet? A team of rivals, that's right, where he took the rivals in the Republican Party and brought them together into the cabinet. And I know David Putnam gave a copy of that to Gordon Brown when he became Prime Minister, in the hope that it would inspire his own approach to leadership as Prime Minister at that time. Unsuccessfully, I've got to say, I think. But I do agree with you profoundly, and if you leave a situation where the presidential Prime Minister is allegedly responsible for everything, it's absolutely not the right way to go. It's very difficult for a Prime Minister in the modern era, because the 24/7 media makes it almost impossible for you to behave in that way. And, for example, in a general election campaign, my own observation of general election campaigns through my political life has just steadily moved towards the role of the Prime Minister or the party leader. Obviously, in the last general election, with the leaders' debates being a major symptom of that. And I don't think that's all the response of the fault of the party leaders. It's very difficult for them to avoid a situation where they scratch their nose, and that's seen as a comment on Mr. Allen's chairmanship of the committee. As it were, it all gets written out into a ridiculous, absurd way. But I think that's the way it's gone. But I don't think that reflects the reality of government. You can't possibly run a major government department if you think you can do everything. I use, in all my ministerial roles, including junior roles, I used to identify 10 to 15 issues which really mattered to me, either because I thought they're important in our manifesto or to the party or what I was personally trying to achieve, and focus on those. And the other, say, 100 issues that would come up, I would normally go with officials' advice, unless I thought it was clearly wrong, if you see what I mean. But you've got to pick and choose which are the things you're really going to try and develop. Or I'd ask one of my junior ministers to take responsibility. I remember asking Stephen Twigg to take responsibility in education for the London Challenge, which was trying to change the performance of secondary schools in London. And he did it extremely well with a very talented official there, who's unfortunately now left. But you have to prioritise in that way, and you have to give responsibility to others. And if you have a concept of elected presidency, that leads to a state of affairs where you can't run anything. You've got to give responsibility out.
We tend to view this permanent merry-go-round of reshuffles as standard. We all suffer or benefit from it, and it's in the papers. But the committee's had the chance to look across the globe at other systems. We are the odd person out here, in that virtually every other Western democracy has a much more stable structure in terms of its political level appointments. Do you think we have a perception problem, or do you think we're the only people getting it right?
Well, no, firstly, I think you're completely correct. Secondly, I think a major reason for that is our adversarial system as opposed to the different electoral systems, sometimes proportional, that exist in other countries, about which there's a separate set of arguments. I personally was in favour of the AV change, which was defeated in the national referendum a year or so ago, whenever it was. But they therefore have more stable parliamentary situations, and therefore can have a more stable governmental situation. That obviously doesn't deal with big political crises, it doesn't deal with deaths if they occur, or major resignations. I think we probably have a culture of more resignations than other, I haven't compared it, but I suspect there are more resignations than in other European countries, for example, mainly because the media is so engaged in the process in a much more substantial way than happens in other countries. But I do think we're out of step, and I don't think it's good that we're out of step. I think we should move in the other direction.
And since you were a Secretary of State, Charles, a phenomena has arisen, which I'm sure you're across, which is the assumption that ministers go on the roundabout has been joined with an assumption that permanent secretaries now are on this roundabout. And actually, contrary to the mythology of Sir Humphrey always being there and the ministers come and go, we've now got a situation where ministers are in post longer than a typical permanent secretary since the last election.
Well, actually, that was happening before the last election. I didn't know the figure you've just given me, but obviously I accept it, but I wasn't aware of it. But the phenomenon you describe, I was extremely well aware of, and it became the case that it was seen as good at senior levels of the civil service, not simply at permanent secretary level, to have relatively short rotation in key jobs. I thought that was a terrible, terrible mistake, because there is such a thing as institutional wisdom, institutional knowledge, institutional memory, and you need it. Any government needs it, needs to understand what has been going on, what the arguments are, how it goes. But I think I didn't check carefully enough the evidence that you've already taken from Bob Kerslake on this, but I think that the civil service would acknowledge that it almost encourages a culture of rotation and sharing of jobs, so people have a wider range of responsibility than used to be the case. And I simply think that is not what should be the case. My father was a permanent secretary. I was brought up knowing about the way the civil service operated, and there was a sense of relative permanence in key areas. Some cases it's personal. There was a very rapid transfer of civil servants at the Treasury in the first part of our government for a variety of different reasons. Now, at the moment, people are leaving the Department of Education in droves for various reasons. The person I mentioned who ran London Challenge, John Coles, would have been an excellent, very excellent senior official at education, but has moved on to work in the not-for-profit sector. Now, why does all this happen? It's a very good question. I think you need to bolster the authority of permanent secretaries in the constitutional system of the country, and you need to encourage relative permanence in the senior official levels. I always say that the key relationship is that between the Secretary of State and the permanent secretary, and they have to have a good relationship. If it goes wrong for any reason, then that is what leads to further problems further on down the line. But that requires a good, solid relationship and a degree of experience in the permanent secretary and senior civil service, which I haven't done the figures, as you have, obviously, but I think it's very, very important to maintain.
Eleanor?
Thank you, William Charles. We've been taking some evidence on the actual mechanics of reshuffles, and you've seen a few of these from various angles. Would you have a recommendation as to how things could be done better as far as handover is concerned and timing?
I saw this in your call for evidence, and I've thought about it, and I don't have anything very helpful to say. As far as the learning in, the reading in of the new minister is concerned, I think it's a pretty efficient system. I mean, there is a pretty effective set of files which are produced. There is a process which works reasonably well. As long as the incoming minister is fairly assiduous and fairly intelligent, they can get on top of the issues quite well. The quality of the briefing is normally good. So I wouldn't say that in terms of the minister coming in, I've got a great deal to say. I think there's a great deal of benefit in our system of it being so quick, literally less than a day for it to happen. I think that makes it easier to take place rather than the reverse. I think there might be a case for institutionalising more of a dialogue between the incoming minister and the outgoing ministers to see what was on the political agenda in that area. I think that happens fairly little. It happened fairly little in my case. And I think that would be a good thing to do, but is probably quite difficult for various sensitivities and so on. As far as the actual process is concerned, I watched it in opposition when I used to work for Neil Kinnock, which was a different state of affairs, and I saw it in government as a victim of it, as it were, in a variety of different ways. I think it's very, very, very difficult to see how you could do it. Obviously, everybody would agree it needs to be done more quickly than it often is. Obviously, everybody would agree it's better as well not to forget people, which some prime ministers have done and left them out completely by accident. Obviously, it would be better for conversations to take place properly. There are a number of people who feel very bitter and angry that they weren't properly spoken to by the party leader as they left. In defence of the party leaders, I think it's quite difficult to have these conversations, particularly in the media world, where people can literally go out of the office and talk immediately to a wide variety of people. I think that's very difficult to operate with. So I've thought about it before you asked the question, in the sense that I looked at your call for evidence, but I haven't got anything very creative to say, I'm afraid, about it.
Because it might be that we are prodding around to see what is actually happening and how it could be done better and how we can be constructive. But in fact, it would be quite a good conclusion if we concluded that the way things are done at present is just about as well as they can be done, given the politics of it, as opposed to the practicalities. But it is the act of reshuffling a government is essentially political, as you said a few months ago.
I'm not far from that position, and if you look at some of the long drawn out issues, let's take the chairmanship of the governors of the trustees of the BBC, for example, or the appointment of governor of the Bank of England, or whatever, albeit in a more kind of steady process, allegedly, but going on for an enormous long time, giving rise to a wide degree of uncertainty. I don't think it's obvious, let's put it with a double negative, I don't think it's obvious that this anarchic, chaotic system of instant change is that much worse than the other regimes. And that's really the conclusion I came to when I thought about it. I can't think of a system which will work much better. But responding to Tristram's point earlier, I think the personality of the Prime Minister is exceptionally important, and you can't really legislate for that. But the fact is, the Prime Minister has to decide how they want to conduct their government, if I can put it like that. And they should want to conduct it in a way which promotes stability.
Thank you.
So, a really quick one, Paul.
Okay, Tony Blair put a few reshuffled sacked ministers back into other ministerial jobs, not many, but presumably to encourage all the other sacked ministers not to become troublemakers on the back benches. In this Parliament, we've got something new, in which 4 of the reshuffled ministers this time were given knighthoods. Do you think this is legitimate? Is this a way of further degrading the honours system? Or do you think it's sensible for the Prime Ministers to redistribute the sweeties?
I think the knighthood system is absolutely mad and has got nothing to defend it whatsoever. Okay. And I think the use to which this Prime Minister's put it has been disgraceful. I do think it's perfectly appropriate for people to come back to office in other roles, including less senior roles. I think there's plenty of people who are capable of being ministers of state or parliamentary undersecretaries that weren't very good at being cabinet members, and I see no dishonour in that.
Thank you. Charles, I'm so sorry to have to close this down after half an hour. Very good to see you again. If you feel you want to drop us a line with any further thoughts, feel free. But thank you so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
Very good to see you. Very good to see you back in the House of Commons, may I say. Michael, you know that we're doing a study at the moment, an inquiry into the concept of reshuffles, and we would like your expertise and knowledge to be brought to bear on that topic. Is there anything you want to say to start us off, or shall we jump straight into questions?
I'll leave it to you.
Right. Andrew, I think you're up first.
I'd like to ask you about, in your experience, what impact do reshuffles have on the effectiveness of government and the authority of the Prime Minister?
I think there's no general answer to that question. It depends entirely on the circumstances, on the relative rebalancing, the success or otherwise, the economic pressures of the government at the time, whether a reshuffle can contribute or not. I don't think there's a generalised answer. They are part of politics. You have to have them. There's no escape. And you have to do them for all sorts of different reasons. But each one is sui generis.
Right. So, but it is necessary that they do, because most countries don't have mid-term reorganising of the response.
Yeah. Well, I think that I can't conceive of a situation where the pressures that build up, both for more action and for political success within our system, avoids there being reshuffle processes.
Why is that?
Well, I can't pretend to have been part of any other legislative process, but this one is immensely intimate. We are a very over-centralised government, and the focus on what the Prime Minister is doing every minute of every day, and the sort of accountability that goes with that, demands this sort of instant result, this ever-present sense of drive and being in charge. And if you've got a government department that isn't delivering, the short answer is to change the minister. If you've got a successful minister, the pressure is to say, well, let's give them a bigger role. You've got a whole range of people in the House of Commons, largely, who think they should be ministers. Some of them are right. And so you've got the younger generations pressing. You've got every sort of pressure there all the time, and that's our system. Now I can't pretend to know how relevant that is in other systems, but I don't think you can eliminate it from our system.
Is it the case that the number of reshuffles in this Parliament has only been one significant reshuffles? That's about half, at least half. In half a Parliament, that's 2.5 years. Would you say that what has been done in the way of reorganisation is better this time than last time in the law?
I don't think you can put strike rules over these things.
Yeah.
I mean, firstly, who would know the answer to that question, except people living with it day by day, and mercifully I don't have to do that. So I don't think you can compare one reshuffle with another.
But as a new minister, how long would it take to gain an understanding of the subject area and function effectively?
Well, that depends again on the minister. Do they come with any experience of the subject? Are they a promotion from within the department, or have they been in that department, gone somewhere else and come back? Have they been a PPS in that department? Have they specialised it in their own private life or in their public life or whatever it is? Certainly, I remember vividly when I became Secretary of State for the Department of the Environment, I produced an envelope over lunch before I went to the department for the Permanent Secretary with my agenda on it. But then I'd been there twice before, and I'd shadowed it. So I knew exactly what I wanted to try and do. If I'd gone to a department of which I had no knowledge, I know what would have happened. There would have been a pile of files that high telling me what the department thought I ought to know. Mm-hmm. And of course, the great mistake is to read that file of files, because if you do, you're captured. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm being a bit oversimplified. Of course, you have to know what's in it. Mm-hmm. But every department has its own agenda. Yeah. And I remember vividly the burials bill. I doubt if any of you have ever heard of the burials bill. This was a piece of legislation in draft that every Secretary of State was presented with on arrival in the department. Got to tidy up the graveyard, Secretary of State. And here is the draft bill, and will you make a bid to your colleagues for it? I don't think anyone ever did, but it's probably still there, still trying it.
And if I were to ask questions about city deals, would I follow you?
Just at the end, Andrew, I've let Michael know I'd like to raise those issues. Paul?
Your great experience as a very long period you were in ministerial office. Have you any views now about what's happening at sort of 2.5 years into a parliament? And as I said, 18 of the permanent secretaries have gone. One permanent secretary has been slipped black spot after being appointed by Sir Bob Kerslake, and he won't become permanent secretary. And there's an attack by Francis Maud, who said that there are ministers who are obstructing, civil servants who are obstructing what ministers want to have implemented in policy. This is after a reshuffle. Do you think that, in your time, there is a time like this where there will be a serious attempt by government to politicise the civil servants, even after a reshuffle?
Well, I have always had a very clear view about the civil service. I have the highest regard for it. I believe it carried out what I wanted. It didn't always agree, but your task is to detect the disagreement and rule firmly that you have a direction you want them to go. And my experience is they do go where they are directed. The trick is to know how to direct, and this is a question of management, human relations. I describe the civil service, the British civil service, as a Rolls-Royce. Magnificent piece of engineering. No fuel, no driver. That's what ministers do. And if the ministers aren't capable of doing that, then the machine will either stand still or drift downhill or whatever it may be. It has to be driven. And I find that quite acceptable, because I don't want to have a machine which has made up its mind what's going to happen without political control. But and in doing the report I've just done, I've said exactly and found exactly what I always did find.
We've all seen sacked ministers who find themselves deeply shocked by this and have no explanation, because they're certainly, Tony Blair used to tell ministers, you're doing a great job, but I need your job to give to someone else for some political drama that was going on elsewhere. Tony Blair used to reappoint just a handful of sacked ministers to a new ministerial office, presumably to encourage the others who were sacked. In this present Parliament, the Prime Minister is dishing out knighthoods to some of the sacked ministers, and he set up for the first time a special committee to give honours to members of Parliament. Do you think this is a legitimate way to treat the honours system, and likely to lead that into further degradation, or should sacked ministers have these consolation prizes?
I've got no complaint for ministers being recognised in some way. I sit before you as a member of the House of Lords.
Indeed.
And it took 35 years or something for this distinction to be bestowed upon me. I have no problem with that, and I know of no arguments which shouldn't reflect long-serving or diligent or successful members of Parliament. The honour system is built in. If you want to get rid of it, get rid of it, but don't single out members of Parliament as though they shouldn't be part of it. Many of them do a most commendable job.
It's questionable whether members of Parliament would want the same honour bestowed on Sir James Savile and Sir Cyril Smith, perhaps in future. But I think the question is if this is done automatically to sack ministers, and this committee is being set up. I mean, it didn't exist in your time. You didn't have a special committee, which was manned by the whips to give honours to MPs and other parliamentarians.
Well, you tell me something which I have no knowledge whatsoever.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Simon.
We had Chris Mullin in last week,
yeah.
And he was entertaining us with stories of sort of Blair reshuffles and how relentlessly sort of substandard they were by the Prime Minister's own admission. I think he said, we don't seem to do this terribly well, do we? And they seem to go on for an awful long time and never really satisfy anybody. How could the process be improved? And so that actually people on the outside understand what the hell's going on as well as people on the inside?
I don't think it can. If you tell someone their career is over and they've lost their job, there's no nice way of doing it.
But if you don't mind me just following up that, one of the questions we've been asking previous witnesses is, do we have to do it in one big sort of set-piece event? Or should we look at it in, I suppose, in a slightly more corporate way, that if somebody isn't doing their job, you don't wait till September next year when a reshuffle might be penciled into the number 10 diary. You move them on there and then, or move them up or move them out, whatever it might be, instead of and allowing this huge sort of press build-up, which almost, in a sense, drives the process itself. I'm wondering if there was, we should make less drama, or could we make less drama?
You could, but then you'd inject a degree of temporary uncertainty into the whole thing. People are always looking over their shoulders as the knife's about to fall. You know, whatever system you come up with, you'll be left with the human dimension. I don't think there's any way to do it nicely or get it right or whatever it may be. There's one aspect of reshuffle which I do remember, which may be worth just putting before your committee. It's amazing how little a Secretary of State can know about the junior ministers in their department. First of all, they don't see them that often. They see them more now than they used to, but Peter Walker introduced, and I continued, a very intimate relationship with ministers where broadly we met every day. That's very exceptional. But you only then see your ministerial colleague in fairly unusual circumstances, whereas the whips see them all the time. And they know where they are, they know what they're doing, they know what their interests are, what their public interests are and what their private interests are. And so I can remember occasions when people were reshuffled in my department. To my amazement, seemed to be doing a perfectly reasonable job. I hadn't been consulted, and one day they went. But when I found out why they'd gone, there were curious reasons, not always apparent.
Well, we did ask the head of the civil service a couple of weeks ago whether it would be sensible to allow Secretaries of State to have more say in the appointments of their junior ministers. And I think there was a sort of shaken expression on his face that such an idea could be mentioned. But would that help at all?
Well, I was very fortunate in that on each occasion, I asked the Prime Minister if I could choose my team. And invariably I got a significant way towards achieving that. And there was always only one reason. I thought I could detect ministers who could deliver. And I wanted delivering ministers, because my first task in assuming a ministerial, Secretary of State job was to delegate all my responsibilities. Except in defence, where security, intelligence, you couldn't. But everything else was delegated to one of my colleagues, and I always had big departments, so there were always 5 or 6 colleagues. At that point, I knew that everything would come to me from a colleague, so that the party political angle would have been thought about at least once. And a politician would have sieved the information that was coming to me to make sure that it was in line with what the party might think, what colleagues might think, it had a political dimension. But it also left me free then to see whether I thought progress was being made, keep constantly in touch with the colleague, and play a sort of driving role in the department. But I mean, one of my obsessions, of course, is that nobody knows what's happening in departments. There is no management information system. I mentioned this pile of files, that is certainly ever present, but how do you know whether it's the right pile, or all of pile, or that it tells the whole story, or it's independent, or whatever? You don't. And if you actually say to yourself, well, I'm in charge of 1,500 people, or in my case, 52,000 people, what are they doing? Nobody can answer that question until you has management systems where you can answer that question, you can't effectively run the department. But nobody knows. No civil servant knows, no minister knows. That is, in my view, a huge lacuna in our arrangements.
Chris Mullen was quite emphatic about the fact that sort of longevity was important, and he put a sort of minimum 2.5 year term on as being the bare minimum necessary to become an effective minister and to slightly overcome the problem that you raise. Is that a reasonable timescale? I think he said he was the 8th African minister in 7 years, and he said that was not an effective way of running the department.
Oh, well, let's take the Department of Trade and Industry, which I know something about. Under both the Conservative and the Labour governments, I think they've moved in and out about once every year, something like that, 18 months at most. I mean, there were 3 of us who were there for 3 years, Lord Mandelson, Lord Young and myself, but the others were there in and out. And it just tells you what you need to know about the attitude towards trade and industry. Because, of course, you can. I mean, the fascinating thing about party politics is that each party is a coalition, and you can get differences in opinion within a party which are starker and more extreme than between parties. And certainly, I mean, I could go through the Secretary of State that I knew about, and the differences between what I believe and what they believed were very, very sharp. So you get a guy coming in, he's got a view. I come in and I say, what's the industrial strategy? And they said, we're not allowed to use the words. That was the first reply. I mean, unbelievable.
Thank you very much. I didn't know that.
Michael, there's not a complete read across between business and politics, and there never will be. But you have served in a distinguished capacity in both. In your business life, you no doubt had effective in-service training, you had means of spotting talent, you, as the boss, would never have appointed someone just for a year or so. You would replace people when they needed to be replaced, rather than have your business in a sense of paralysis, awaiting your decision on whether your key employees would be in a job or not after the summer. And yet, coming into politics, we seem to accept, at least in this country, but in no other democracy, that reshuffles on a regular basis are a somehow acceptable part of political life. Doesn't one half of you really rail against the way we conduct our politics in such a disorganised and short-termist way?
Well, of course, I'm very sympathetic to the problem you raise. But I think that there are important things to say as well. First of all, I don't believe that you should have a government which is all business people. I don't believe you should have a political party which is all business people. I mean, this is a parliamentary democracy representative of a society, and I think that's very important. So where would my instinct be in squaring this circle between having management efficiency and a broad representation? Well, I think my answer would be threefold, I think. One would be induction courses for ministers, which certainly never did happen. I mean, whether they do or not, I don't know. Secondly, a management information system which is transparent and which means that there is a factual basis upon which judgments can be made. And thirdly, a creative tension within government that scrutinises the performance of departments constantly, so that the sort of problems that I identify within our system are much less likely to happen. You get a minister appointed who has a strong view on something, and it's an important issue, and they come up with an initiative, and that will get good press. It will take a year at least before it has any credibility on the ground, because how can you compare with one year from another till you've had a year? By that time, if the guy is being successful, there'll be talk about his promotion or her promotion. But the initiative will probably be very superficial within the context of the whole problem. And before you know where you are, another minister comes, the initiative falls away, the problem remains. If I could give, to me, the single biggest example, our education system. I mean, the government figures are stark. There were 571 sink schools. 20% of the children coming out of our education system are either illiterate or illiterate by modern standards. Those are not my figures, and that has been the position in broad terms since they started talking about it in the Victorian age. This place tolerates it. It is intolerable. So that's the sort of, I mean, I could go on endless examples of this phenomenon, but that's the worst of them. And it isn't hidden. We all know it. And all across the world, education standards are rising. The competitive challenge is becoming more intense. And you've only got to go to any of these countries, and you can see it in the streets, the way they just walk in their uniforms smartly, in their classrooms the same disciplines apply. We have to face that challenge, and we don't. Now, that's not a criticism of this government. This is a criticism of the body politic. And I happen to believe Michael Gove is making important initiatives in dealing with this. But the statistics are still there.
I'm deeply tempted to launch into my other favourite topic, which is early intervention and getting to the babies, children and young people before they go wrong rather than after. But I think my colleagues would not forgive me if I did that. Michael, I gave you very little warning, but if we may we ask you a couple of questions while we have you here on your recent report, because it's pertinent to some of the work we're doing, particularly on distinguishing local government from central government and giving local government a little more autonomy. It's one of the reports, inquiries we're making at the moment. And I know Andrew wanted to pick this up in particular, and myself too.
Yes, the proposal is that city deals should get an amount of money from the government, but they are to spend it. That's basically what's happened. Is this in addition to or alternative to the money that they're getting?
You're talking in terms of my report?
Yes, yes.
Well, my report is not restricted to city deals. It is restricted to taking the largely capital figure in the existing public expenditure levels and making it available to competitive bidding from the LEPs, the Local Enterprise Partnerships. There are 39 of those LEPs. And there is something of the order of £60 billion over a period in the public expenditure as reduced.
Yeah.
And you put that up for competitive bidding. The virtue of doing that is not just place-based politics and local initiative, but if you make it competitive, instead of you getting £1 of housing money spent on the ground, you get £1 of housing money, but somebody says we will add another £3 of our own money to it. So you get gearing. And the precedents are clear, from the Urban Grant, from City Challenge, from Development Corporation, to the Regional Growth Fund, and City Deals. This is now a well-documented, proven process, but it's too small scale. And so my report says we've done enough experimentation, go for it.
And what about the rural areas? I mean, this is exactly the same. In other words, the Cornwall or the Isle of Wight would get the money direct, or it would be decided where it goes in Southampton or Portsmouth?
The Local Enterprise Partnership, which covers, well, basically it's Redcliffe Maud in the 1960s. It's
Yes.
a city-state.
Yeah.
So the local enterprise partnership, which are a partnership between local stakeholders, local government, local private sector, academia, whatever, they design a plan. Government has just given them each £250,000 for 2 years, each year, in order to prepare the plans, in order to make the bids, which will become relevant in 2015. That's how the system works. And I'm very encouraged by the Chancellor's response in the autumn statement.
Okay, thank you.
Michael, I press you further on this in terms of the role of local government.
Yeah.
We have a procession of witnesses on virtually whatever topic we're covering, who tell us we are the most over-centralised Western democracy, and that most other places have much more leeway and independence for their local units, whatever they are, and they're normally supported by some sort of constitutional settlement, which means the centre can't take those powers away. Do you feel that that is a trend? Having read your report carefully, I know the answer, but do you feel that is a trend that we ought to follow in this country and free up our local government to get on and do more of the work?
Well, I think we should reverse the trend of 100 years, which I think has neutered the vast areas of this country outside London. And as I said, the government has begun to pursue a localist agenda. They make speeches about localism, and so their credibility is clearly behind the concept. And they've now said they're going to move positively on a much bigger scale. We have to wait now until the spring to find out the detail of that.
Excellent. Michael, thank you so much. I'm so sorry that it's only been half an hour, and I also am very sorry that we didn't invite you in as a witness on our local government inquiry. I think that would have been a wonderful hour-and-a-half session, but perhaps we can write to you with any more questions we might have.
For any more questions, you can ask Christopher Choke, because he worked with me in the DTI, he knows all my...
And very, very remarkably has been quiet in this session, so thank you, Michael. John, how are you? Come in. Good to see you. You're following in distinguished footsteps with Charles Clark, Michael Heseltine, John.
I've just been speaking to Charles there. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good to see you. Good to see you, John. You know what we're doing. We're in the middle of an inquiry on reshuffles and all things to do with reshuffles. And we had a set of very distinguished witnesses, and I think it would be true to say there's a sort of thread developing that the shuffle itself is a very difficult thing. It's a very personal thing. There's not an easy way for people to move on or move across or whatever at one level. Also, there's a bit of a trend line around, okay, it may be difficult, but do we need to do it so much? And Chris Mullin in particular put on the table a figure, and he said you can't really be good at your job unless you've been working through, and you should be left in place for 2 years, was his view. And I think there's one or two people have echoed that sentiment, if not the exact number. So what's your own view on those two things, John, the immediate and the personal, and the length of time you need to get on and do the job well?
I think I'm pretty certain it is a difficult experience for those who are reappointed, particularly for those who aren't, and probably for the Prime Minister at any time as well. I mean, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, but it's said that Barbara Castle, when she was finally removed from the cabinet by, I think it was Jim Callaghan, I may be wrong in these dates, but it's said that Jim Callaghan said to her how difficult all this was, and Harold Wilson had told them this was the most difficult part of the job, to which she immediately responded, that's why he never did it, which I thought was quite an apt quote. I think the public nature of what happens and the fact that it becomes an annual or biannual ritual and all happens at the same time, I don't see why we can't find a better way of doing that. You know, in any business, you would promote or demote people at not in a particular time of the year, but whenever it was felt appropriate to move people on. I understand that it's more difficult in politics because when you move one piece, then you have to try and balance it up with different groups, different regional men and women and so on. But I'm not a great fan of the annual reshuffle type thing. I think also on occasions it's probably used to divert attention from a particular problem the government has. Let's have a reshuffle, renew, or at least give the perception of renewal. On the second point, just that Chris Millen was talking about, what was that, Mr. Chairman?
Just on the length of time that...
that, I think that's a more difficult one. In an ideal world, you would spend, a few years in each job. I think it is difficult to get a metric about at what point does a minister become effective. I mean, I was sent a circular, I think by Anthony King, which asked me to tick a box 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years and so on. I don't think you can do that, actually. I know it sounds very British to say it, but it all depends. There are certainly some jobs I took for which I felt pretty adequately prepared, either through life experience or, in the case of my first job, 7 years preparatory work. There were other positions where I was pretty well thrown in, and it took a lot of time to get to grips with the portfolio. However, I would qualify it with this perspective. Certainly at the cabinet level, at Secretary of State level, I think you have to distinguish between three things. One is leadership, one is management, and one is technocracy. And it is possible to give leadership and to have the qualities necessary to give leadership before you are a technocratic expert in your department. In that sense, a Secretary of State, I think, is more a chairman of the board than a chief executive. There are people there who should do management, and for the most part, the civil service do it very well. And I personally wouldn't want members of Parliament or government involved in the appointment or selection of those people. I know that's the current debate at the moment. I think that would be a wrong move. There is also in the civil service an amazing reservoir of knowledge of the detail in various aspects of the department's business. So I think that it is possible, dependent on the qualities of an individual and dependent on that individual's background and experience, to become an effective Secretary of State quite quickly. In other circumstances, it will take a great deal of time. Does that answer the point you're making?
It's very helpful, John, yeah.
Thank you. Actually, John, I think you just answered just about all of the questions because you know this subject pretty well. And I remember a point where you were moving regularly from place to place, clearing up messes that other ministers had left behind.
But I wouldn't quite see it that way. That kind of casts aspersion on my predecessors. I don't think
don't
that's
ask
the
you
case.
to comment on that. I'm not asking you to comment on that. But you were moving from place to place. Would it be reasonable to say that, you know, people on the outside sometimes say, how can somebody go in and be a minister? For example, in education, if they've never been a teacher, for example, in transport, if they've never flown a plane, etc., or whatever. Would it be reasonable to say that the expertise that a minister brings is in being a politician and bringing the political aspect to add to the managerial aspect of the department?
Yeah, I think it would be difficult to paint a picture of the criteria or the qualities that you want a Secretary of State to have. Yeah. But I think if you were approximating towards the ideal, you would pick a man or woman who was capable of assimilating masses of information and applying a degree of intellectual rigour in terms of analysis. Somebody who had the capacity to make decisions on big issues. Somebody who could give the strategic leadership and carry people with them, identifying the primary strategic objectives of a particular department and explaining the route and points in that direction. A capacity to undertake extremely long hours under considerable pressure. And also, I think, from the civil service point of view you're working with, I think Gerald Kaufman got it right years ago, and he said the civil service hate a minister that doesn't know what he wants, but they also dislike a minister who knows what he wants but won't listen to the potential downstream consequences of the action that he's taking. I think if you got those qualities, and I'm not claiming those qualities, but I think that the nearer you approximate towards them, then the nearer you come to the sort of qualities that a Secretary of State would benefit from, particularly the leadership, because you're right, you have to carry your department, you have to carry your cabinet, you have to carry your parliament, you have to carry the public. And then, of course, at the back of your mind is always the values that your party is supposed to enshrine and your constituency and constituents and others would look for you to exhibit. But I think all of that is true. To answer your practical point, there are some, speaking from own experience, there are some positions that I took where I felt reasonably well qualified to move into and be effective from a very early stage. My first post, because as Armed Forces Minister, because I had spent 7 years reading military history, meeting the troops, discussing with people, and to the credit of the previous Conservative government, including the then Minister of Armed Forces, Nicholas Soames, they had facilitated this because they had allowed me to come in a long period before the civil service would normally have required them to allow me to come in. And that meant when I came back as Defence Secretary, of course, I had then done about 8.5 years on the defence side. When I was appointed to Scotland, I had a pretty good awareness as Secretary of State for Scotland of what was going on and what was required. In Northern Ireland, although I was appointed, again, it was one of those occasions when someone resigned. Anyone who's brought up as a working class Catholic in the west of Scotland had a pretty good understanding of the issues and the history, going back to the 12th century, of the conflict. And the final thing, but in other cases, transport, I had no particular knowledge, no particular interest. I didn't want to go. I liked being Armed Forces Minister. And the first day I was there, I remember, they were doing the roads review, which consisted of me at the dispatch box and Glenda Jackson, the Under-Secretary, tearing pages out of a large briefing book to put in front of me when somebody asked me what was the latest plans for the A373 going through somewhere or other. Health took me a bit of time to get a grip on because I didn't seek the health post. But Alan Milburn had indicated he wanted to leave it. So that's why I say it depends. It depends on the circumstances. Generally speaking, I think we turn over ministers too quickly. I don't think secretaries of state, I certainly didn't seek the number of posts that I had. But then you're part of a collective and basically you have to do what is required in the collective.
I think that sums it up very well. Thank you.
Chris?
I think you had 7 cabinet posts in 9 years.
I had 7 in the cabinet, 8 at or in the cabinet, because Minister of Transport was in.
Okay. So when you moved into those posts, did the person whom you were succeeding brief you at all? And when you moved out of those posts, did you brief your successor at all?
Yes, in some cases. I remember, for instance, when I took over in Northern Ireland for Peter Manderson, even although he was in difficult circumstances at the time that caused his resignation, he was kind enough to phone me and to meet with me almost immediately and to go over some of the major issues which he thought I should know about, some of the background and so on. When I took over at Health, Alan Milburn did the same. In Scotland it was rather more difficult because Donald Dewar, who had been the previous Secretary of State, had gone to be the First Minister. So I was engaged continually with him. It was about a fortnight before we devolved it. In other cases, in Armed Forces Minister and Defence Secretary, as I said, I had spent some years doing that, but my predecessors were available and I had a chat with Jeff Hoon. So, yes, and when I went, I always made it plain to my successor that I was available. I mean, there's a fine line between failing to move on and trying to do somebody's job when they come in and actually offering yourself and giving a briefing. But for instance, I would have spoken to Paul Murphy, Helen Liddell when she came in at Scotland. I think what it's also, I'm not sure that this is relevant to what you're asking, but you may find it helpful. I think you also have to very quickly have, as you go in, a view of your strategic objectives. I'm not saying everybody would agree with those strategic objectives, even within my own party, but you have to have a view of where you want to get to. You know, when I went in as Armed Forces Minister, I knew that we needed and wanted a strategic defence review, which we carried out in 97, 98, and we carried that out. When I then went to Transport, I knew that one of the reasons I went there under John Prescott was to deliver the new underground link to the Millennium Dome by the millennium, because any government that couldn't deliver a link to the Millennium Dome by the millennium wasn't going to be trusted to deliver much else. So that was one of the objectives. When I went to Northern Ireland, it was to achieve decommissioning of weapons from the IRA, to get a general acceptance inside the nationalist community of the Reformed Police Service, and if possible, to get a declaration that the war was over, so that not only was a theoretical end to violence, but an actual end to violence. And we achieved 2 of those in that period. So in each of them, in Scotland, I recall that the strategic objective was to establish a competent and working Scottish Parliament, but clearly within the constitutional settlement of the United Kingdom. So it's a devolved Parliament, not a separate one.
Did you decide those strategic objectives for yourself? Were you advised about them by your predecessor? Did the Prime Minister tell you what they were, or did the Permanent Secretary tell you?
No, not the Permanent Secretary. The strategic objectives of the government stem from the political values, manifesto and direction of the government. So they would derive through discussion between yourself and the Prime Minister. And then, of course, part of the job is to persuade, to make aware your ministerial team of those objectives. And I'm a great believer in devolving power to ministers. I mean, I think if you speak to the ministers who work for me, I think they would confirm that I would set out strategic priorities, but within each of their areas, would then let them get on with it, unless there was such a major issue, they had to discuss it with the Secretary of State, or there was a train coming down the tunnel, or some major disaster. But ministers ought to be decision makers as well within their own field.
Yes. Do you think there are too many ministers?
I don't think there are too many ministers, no. And I'll tell you why. I think the amount of information that is now not available but imposed upon decision makers of all types. I mean, we live in a networked world where there is a tsunami of data comes in to decision makers in the private sector as well as in the public sector. It comes in real time, so the time you have to make decisions is much shorter. Every aspect of life now in the digital age, in the cyber age, is under scrutiny. So the ability to analyse information and to make decisions, and the requirement of the public scrutiny of decisions is much more difficult than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Of course, not all data is information. I mean, there's masses of data, but if it doesn't change your perception or knowledge, it isn't information, it is data. And yet we continually send each other data on emails and so on. So you can imagine the amount that's coming into ministers.
But the aspiration of the government is to reduce the number of MPs down to 600.
Yeah.
And the government's rather coy about whether or not they wish to reduce the number of ministers.
Yeah.
But obviously one of the jobs of parliamentarians is to hold ministers to account.
Yes.
So would you agree that there should be a significant reduction in the number of ministers if there's a reduction in the number of MPs?
No.
So that would be strengthening the executive over Parliament enormously.
No, first of all, that presupposes that I agree with the reduction of MPs. I don't. I think MPs are much maligned. I think the vast majority of MPs I know are people who work extremely hard, 7 days a week, and now find themselves abused because there is an expenses system that is meant to ensure that not only the rich can come to Parliament, but that it is possible for working people to come to Parliament. My guess would be that there is the same percentage of people in Parliament who are misusing that as there would be in any other organisation outside. So I don't necessarily agree that the demands on MPs are such that you can reduce the number. And therefore the premise in which you're asking the question falls. Even if there was to be a reduction, I believe that demands of modern government are such that the number of ministers that we have shouldn't be reduced. When I come into Parliament, a very wise old head and former Home Secretary, Merlin Rees, told me never to tell anybody the hours that I worked, because either they'd think I was lying or they would think I was completely mad to do it. And yet, if you read large sections of the press, you would believe in the misrepresentation, which was, I suppose, best signalled during the alternative vote campaign by a television advert video showing an MP hiding behind his curtain when the constituent came. I think that is a calumny on most MPs.
And recently aided and abetted by none other than the chairman of the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, Sir Ian Kennedy.
Well, I don't have any comment to make on that. I don't know the detail.
Paul?
You remind me of the AV vote when, as I crossed Vauxhall Bridge every morning, I saw an advert there that said that if we had AV, to mean that more babies would die in hospital and more soldiers would die in Afghanistan. I never quite got the point, but I mean it was a time of a low point in advertisements on the democratic process. You seem to be the victim or the beneficiary of more moves than anyone else. I think Tony Blair put you in as a safe power of hands or a hard man in various situations, many of them arising, as you said, unexpectedly. I mean, do you think that we need a system that doesn't depend on these regular moves, and that we need more stability and fewer reshuffles generally?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Incidentally, I hope you don't mind me commenting. I don't know where this hard man comes from. I suspect it's partly my Glasgow accent.
Well, exactly. I mean, all the villains have Glasgow
I once
accents,
explained to Mr. Jeremy Paxman, who was having a discussion with two other chaps from private school, as if I didn't exist. I was at the end of the table. When he turned to interview me, I made the point that, sometimes I think that if you went to a particular type of school and got 3 O-levels in basket weaving, you're regarded as an intellectual. But if you get a PhD but have a Glasgow accent, then you're immediately classified as just a hard man. So I hope you don't mind me making that comment.
And somebody support you there, look, very, very, very strongly.
But I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I don't think a minister or a Secretary of State actually wants to move that often. I certainly didn't. I can tell you that I didn't want to move from Armed Forces Minister to Minister of Transport, even though it was at the Cabinet. I would have preferred to stay, and without getting into any details, I made that absolutely plain to the Prime Minister at the time. I didn't particularly want to go to health. One, I didn't think I was sufficiently aware of the health portfolio, to which I was told, but I was a very quick learner. And secondly, and just as importantly, I was a Scottish MP, and this was the English Health Service. So, but I didn't particularly want to leave Defence when I was Secretary of State for Defence, to go to the Home Office. And these are no reflections on the Home Office or any other department. I didn't want to go. I thought, having served a year or something as Secretary of State for Defence, to move on was a bad thing for me, for Defence and so on. And I think we went through a ridiculous number of Defence Secretaries. The problem, Paul, is that events happen. Now, I went to Northern Ireland because Peter Mandelson had to resign. I went to the Home Office because Charles decided to resign over a dispute he had with the Prime Minister about moving him. I went to Health because Alan Milburn decided to resign. So, in a sense, those 3 mini reshuffles, whether it was me or somebody else, would have happened. And the first one, of course, was Armed Forces Minister. And that was when the government came in. So certainly in half of these moves, it was almost inevitable that somebody would have been moved. But it's not satisfactory.
Sure. I mean, we've got to come up with some recommendations on this, and virtually all the evidence is that the system doesn't work. In your case, you were either moved sideways or promoted. There are others who were sacked and sort of feel that they failed in life to this day, years later. And it all seemed to be, or lots of it was part of an irrational game of prime ministerial chess that we were playing. You can't always explain them in terms of ability or in any other way.
Well, first of all, I think it's a subjective decision by the Prime Minister, so it's very difficult, and I'm not sure it's not illusory to search for some metrics by which the Prime Minister should judge it. I've tried to identify some of the qualities which, if I were Prime Minister, I would look for in the Secretary of State. I mean, that's the qualities that I outlined at the beginning. Secondly, I agree with you that the present way of doing it, and the big reshuffle with the media circus and so on, adds a degree of humiliation. I mean, I've been fortunate. I have never been sacked. Indeed, I was fortunate, probably uniquely, to decide in advance that I would voluntarily step down from the cabinet the day Gordon Brown came in. And I did that because I thought it was the honourable thing to do. Having done it, incidentally, I thought it was the honourable thing to do to keep quiet. So that's why I went into radio silence for 3 years. So I've never been in that position. I had the luxury of making a decision and deciding that, well, it wasn't for me, actually, to stay for the status of the car or whatever if I didn't have full confidence in the regime, as it were. But I can imagine that for people who were sacked, that it must be an excruciatingly humiliating experience, the walk down Downing Street and so on. I'm not quite sure whether that would be the case if they were spaced out throughout the year, because there's a sense in which if they were spaced throughout the year and you were sacked, you would be the person who was immediately covered in the news and the press. I think in an ideal world this would be regarded by the press and the media as the natural part of the evolution of an organisation, as it is in the private sector. But it doesn't happen that way given the public scrutiny.
There's a fascinating tension developing now, which happens in probably all governments, between, Francis Maud recently said that the civil servants are not carrying out the wishes of his ministers, and other signs of tension between the civil service and the government. I mean, the Prime Minister has slipped the black spot to the person chosen to do the job in the Department of Energy. Do the frequent reshuffles weaken the role of government and strengthen the role of, well, we do call them permanent secretaries, but I mean, 18 of the permanent secretaries have gone, the 20, so they're less permanent than they used to be. But doesn't it alter that tension?
Well, that, I'm not trying to avoid your question, that depends again on the minister. I mean, I have known ministers who are good managers and become extremely good technocrats, but actually don't have a grasp of strategic leadership, either in the department or indeed for the government as a whole. I mean, I think that one of the reasons that I found myself in the media so often defending the government and subjects that were not actually my own portfolio is that, along with one or two others, Margaret Beckett springs to mind, John Hutton, we had an overall understanding of the strategic purpose of the government and the values that lay behind it. So I think that there are exceptions, but all other things being equal, it must be right that what you're saying about your strength vis-a-vis the civil service being weakened if there's continual changes, because there isn't that continuity. Having said that, I change quite often, and I'd like to think, and you could obviously talk to people who work with me in the civil service, that I worked reasonably well with them. I mean, the only occasion I can remember in which it was wrongly said that I might be at odds with my civil servants was when I was at the Home Office. And it was said by characterising the Home Office as deficient in a number of areas that that somehow this must mean that I was at odds with them, with the top civil servants. That was the interpretation in the press. And as so often happens, the press had no idea whether this was the case or not. In fact, it wasn't, because the words I used, include not fit for purpose, were not actually mine. They were the words of the most senior civil servant in the department, who